Chapter 35 of A Popular History of the Art of Music, from the Earliest Times Until the Present, by W.S.B. Mathews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Virtuosity in the 19th Century. Paganini, Berlioz, Chopin, Liszt. Part 1. Strictly speaking, there was no break in the continuity of art development represented in the virtuoso appearances recorded in Chapter 30 and those with which we have presently to deal. In point of chronology, many of those recorded in the present chapter were contemporaneous with some of those in the former. Nevertheless, the artists with whom we are now concerned represent principles more decidedly belonging to the Romantic, and hence to the 19th century, than did those whose operations have already been discussed as part of the record of the 18th. This is seen in the quality and the novelty of their playing, and still more in the influence which they exercised upon the musicians who came after. Earliest of these in point of time, and most influential in other departments than his own, was the famous Italian violinist, Niccolo Paganini, 1784-1840. Perhaps the most remarkable executant upon the violin who has ever appeared. His father, a clever amateur, had him taught music at an early age, and when only 9 years of age he played in a concert at Genoa with triumphant success. He had already practiced diligently, and, with the intuition of genius, had found out his own ways of accomplishing things, so that when at the age of 11 he was taken to Parma to the teacher Rolla, he was told that there was nothing to teach him. Returning home, he continued his practice, applying himself as much as 8 or 10 hours a day, and producing a number of compositions so difficult that he alone could play them. His first European tour took place in 1805 and astonished the world. The most marvelous stories were told of him. It was popularly supposed that he could play upon anything, provided only the catgut and the horsehair were furnished him. His first appearance in France was in 1831, and in the same year he played in London. The height of his fame was reached in 1834, at which time Berlioz, the French composer, presented him with a beautiful symphony, Harold en Italie. Notwithstanding the fact that Paganini lost money in Paris, he presented Berlioz with 20,000 francs in order to enable him to pursue his career as a composer unhampered by financial distress. This act was greatly to Paganini's credit, and entirely contrary to the prevalent opinion concerning him, which was that he was very miserly. Among the works which Paganini produced was a set of caprices for the violin, which were essentially novelties for the instrument. He enlarged the resources of the violin in every direction, employing double-stopping, harmonics, and the high positions with a freedom previously unknown. Notwithstanding Spohr's modest remark that upon a certain evening when playing for some amateurs he delighted them with all the Paganini juggles, it is certain that he did nothing of the kind. It is impossible, after this lapse of time, to realize the sensation which Paganini's appearances made. His tall, emaciated figure and haggard face, his piercing black eyes, and the furor of passion which characterized his playing, made him seem like one possessed, and many hearers were prepared to assert of their own knowledge that they had seen him assisted by the evil spirit. His caprices remain the sheet anchor of the would-be virtuoso. The entire art of violin playing rests upon 2 works, the Bach sonatas for violin solo and the great Paganini caprices. Everything of which the violin is capable, or which any virtuoso has been able to find in it, is contained in these works. Upon 2 composers of this century Paganini's influence was extremely powerful. Schumann took his departure from the Paganini caprices, seeking to perform upon the piano the same kind of effect which Paganini had obtained from the violin, or to discover others equivalent to them. And Liszt set himself to do upon the piano the same kind of impossibilities which Paganini had performed upon the violin. Both these masters accomplished more than they planned for. Schumann enriched the current of musical discourse by his experiments, having their departure from Paganini, thereby accomplishing something which Paganini did not, for while the great violinist's works are of astonishing value for the violin, they are not particularly significant as tone poetry. They are pleasing and sensational, and at times passionate showpieces for the virtuoso. Part 2. Hector Berlioz, 1803-1869, for whose genius Paganini had such admiration, was perhaps the most remarkable French personality in music during the 19th century, and one of the most commanding in the whole world of music. He was born at Grenoble, in the south of France. His father, a physician, intended that the son should follow his own profession. But when the young Berlioz was sent to Paris to study medicine at the age of 18, music proved too strong for him, and he entered the conservatory as a pupil of Le Sueur. His parents were so incensed by this course that the paternal supplies were cut off, and the young enthusiast was driven to the expedient of earning a scanty living by singing in the opera chorus at an obscure theater, La Gymnase Dramatique. The daring originality of the young musician, and his habit of regarding every rule as open to question, rendered him anything but a favorite with Cherubini, the director of the conservatory, and it was only after several trials that he carried off the prize for composition. The second instance of this kind occurred in 1830, the piece being a dramatic cantata, Sardanapole, which gained him the prize of Rome, carrying with it a pension sufficient to maintain the winner during 3 years in Italy. On his return to Paris, he found it extremely difficult to secure a living by his compositions, their originality and the scale upon which he carried them out, placing them outside the conventional markets for new musical works designed for public performance. In this strait he took to writing for the press. In the Journal des Débats, for which his talent was little if any less marked than for musical production upon the largest scale. As a writer, he was keen, sarcastic, bright, and sympathetic, a man of the world, and at the same time an artist. He touched everything with the characteristic lightness and raciness of the born feuilletoniste. Very soon, in 1834, he produced his symphony Harold en Italie, which Paganini so much admired that he presented Berlioz with the very liberal, even princely, douceur of 20,000 francs, $4,000. Meanwhile, Berlioz was unable to secure recognition in Paris. His compositions were regarded as extravagant and fantastic, and Parisians were curiously surprised at the reception the composer met with in Germany when he traveled there in 1842 and 1843 and again in 1852, bringing out his works. The Germans were by no means unanimous regarding his merits. Mendelssohn, who found Berlioz most interesting as a man, had no admiration for his music. To him it appeared crazy and unbeautiful. The sole recognition which Berlioz had in France was the librarianship of the Conservatoire, with a modest salary and the Cross of the Legion of Honor. In spite of the small esteem in which this clever master was held by his countrymen during his life, he produced a succession of remarkable works without which the art of music would have missed some of its brightest pages. Among these we may mention his dramatic legend of The Damnation of Faust, for solos, chorus, and orchestra, which marks one of the highest points reached by program music. This great work is now generally accepted as one of the best of the Romantic productions, and the orchestral pieces in it have become part of the standard repertory of orchestras everywhere. Berlioz was above all the composer of the grandiose, the magnificent. This appears in his earliest works. In 1837 he composed his Requiem for the funeral obsequies of General d'Amremont. This work is of unprecedented proportions. It is scored for chorus, solos, and orchestra, the latter occasionally of extraordinary appointment. In the Tuba Mirum, for example, he desires full chorus of strings and 4 choirs of woodwind and brass. The woodwind consists of 12 horns, 8 oboes, and 4 clarinets, 2 piccolos, and 4 flutes. The brass is disposed in 4 choirs as follows, each at one of the corners of the stage. The first consists of 4 trumpets, 4 tenor trombones, and 2 tubas. The second of 4 trumpets and 4 tenor trombones. The third the same. The fourth of 4 trumpets, 4 tenor trombones, and 4 ophicleides. The bewildering answers of these 4 choirs of brass give place at the words, "Hear the awful trumpet sounding," to a single bass voice accompanied by 16 kettle drums tuned to a chord. The movement of similar sonority is the Rex Tremendae Majestatis. At other times the work is very melodious. It is indeed singular that a young composer should commence his career with a piece so daring, but to Berlioz's credit it must be said he never makes a mistake in his calculations of effect, when he desires contrast and blending effect of different masses. These results always follow whenever his work is performed according to his directions. All the music of Berlioz belongs to the category of program music, that is to say, everywhere there is an attempt at painting a scene or representing something by means of music, that something being habitually suggested and explained by the text, if the work be vocal, or by explanatory notes, if the work be instrumental. This is as true of his symphonies, Romeo and Juliet and Harold in Italy, as in the vocal works themselves. The list of these contains an oratorio, The Childhood of Christ, 1854, The Damnation of Faust, 1846, the operas Benvenuto Cellini, produced at the Académie, 1838, The Trojans, 1856, Béatrice et Bénédict, 1863. The first was performed under the direction of Liszt at Weimar about 1850, but with indifferent success. Berlioz instrumented several pianoforte compositions for orchestra, the best known of them being Weber's Invitation to the Dance and Polonaise in E-flat. His treatise upon instrumentation, published in 1864, remains standard until since the appearance of the elaborate and more systematic work upon this subject by F.A. Gevert. The greatest of Berlioz's works is his splendid Te Deum, written during the years 1854 and 1855 for some kind of festival performance. He planned this composition as part of a great trilogy of an epic dramatic character in honor of Napoleon, the first consul. At the moment of his return from his Italian campaigns, he was to have been represented as entering Notre Dame, where this Te Deum is sung by an appointment of musical forces consisting of a double chorus of 200 voices, a third choir of 600 children, an orchestra of 134, an organ, and solo voices. The entire work was never completed, and the Te Deum had its first and only representation in Berlioz's lifetime at the opening of the Palace of Industry, April 30th, 1855. The work is full of splendid conceptions and is freer from eccentricities than any other of the author. It is extremely sonorous and is destined to be better known as festival occasions upon a large scale become more numerous. The whole effect of Berlioz's activity was that of a virtuoso in the department of dramatic and descriptive music, and in the art of wielding large orchestral masses. It is curious that between him and Wagner the relations should never have been cordial, although the ends proposed by both were substantially identical, and the genius of both incontestable. Berlioz had no confidence in Wagner's endless melody, and when he writes about music he does so in the attitude of a humble follower of the old masters. Part 3. The progress in piano playing in the course of the 19th century has been most extraordinary. The music of Beethoven and Schubert, composed during the first quarter of this century, and the influence of the virtuosi prominent during that time, whose activity has been told in connection with those of the century previous, the operative principles of which were the ones mainly influencing them, and the continual strife of the piano makers to increase the resonance, singing quality, and artistic susceptibility of the tone, and the strength and elasticity of the action, as recounted in the chapter devoted to the history of this, the greatest of modern instruments, were concentrating influences having the effect of calling attention to the new instrument in a very remarkable manner. Add to these causes the meteor-like appearance of Paganini, with his stupendous execution upon the violin, and its novel possibilities. All these together seem to have led four gifted geniuses at about the same time to make independent investigations into the tonal possibilities of the piano and the mode of producing effects upon it, in the hope of creating a new art and of rivaling the weird successes of the highly gifted Italian, who apparently had exhausted the possibilities of the violin. The artists thus occupied in developing the art of piano playing were Chopin, Liszt, Thalberg, and Schumann. And it is far from easy to determine exactly which one it was who first brought his influence to bear upon the public, or which one it was who first arrived at the successful application of the principles of the new technique, whose essential divergences from the old consisted in a more flexible use of the fingers, hand, and arm, and the cooperation of the foot for promotion of blending and bringing into simultaneous use the tonal resources from all parts of the instrument. In this case, as in so many others of remarkable invention, the improvements seem to have been made by several independent investigators acting simultaneously, each one ignorant of the work of the others. The impulse in the direction of greater freedom had already found expression in the pianoforte pieces of the great master von Weber, whose sonatas and caprices had been published between 1810 and 1820. These contain several novelties, which I have found it more convenient to discuss in connection with a personal history of the composer. Liszt has generally been held as a little the earliest of the four in point of time, his arrangement of Berlioz's Herald Symphony having been published according to the dates in Weitzmann's History in 1827, but according to more accurate information in 1835, while he had published his arrangement of the Paganini Caprices in 1832, 1 year after hearing Paganini. In these works Liszt makes demands upon the hands which were not recognized as among the possibilities of the old technique. But for all this, it is apparently certain that the honor of having developed a style distinctly original and with peculiarities easily recognizable by the average listener belongs to the great virtuoso Thalberg. Sigismund Thalberg, 1812 to 1871, was the illegitimate son of Prince Dietrichstein, a diplomat then living at Geneva. His mother was the Baroness von Wetzlar. Thalberg was carefully educated and accustomed to high-bred society from childhood. His father intended him for a diplomatic career, but the boy's talent for the piano was irresistible, and so well had his education been advanced by his teacher, the first bassoonist of the Vienna Opera, that by the time he was 15 he made a brilliant success at a concert in Vienna. His first composition in the style, which he afterward made so famous, was the Fantasia on Themes from Euryanthe, which was published in 1828. Later, in 1835, he entered upon his public career as virtuoso, with concert tours to all parts of the world, everywhere greeted with admiration and astonishment. He appeared in Paris late in 1834 or early in 1835, finding Liszt there in the plenitude of his powers. Then there was a rivalry between them, and opposing camps were instituted of their respective admirers. The dispute as to their relative excellence ran high, and as usually happens in personal questions of this sort, victory did not belong entirely to either party. Nevertheless, at this distance it is not easy to see why the question should have been raised, since in the light of modern piano playing, Liszt's art had in it the promise of everything which has come since, while Thalberg's had in it only one side of the modern art. Thalberg had a wonderful technique in which scales of marvelous fluency, lightness, clearness, and equality intervene between chord passages of great breadth and sonority, so that all the resources of the piano were open to him. But his specialty was that of carrying a melody in the middle of the piano, playing it by means of the two thumbs alternately, the other hand being occupied in runs and passages, covering the whole compass of the piano, crossing the melody from below or descending upon it from the highest regions of the treble, and continuing down the keyboard with perfect equality and lightness, without in the slightest degree disturbing the singing of the melody. This of its own accord went on in the most artistic manner, as if the pianist had nothing at all else to do than to sing it. The perfection of Thalberg's melody playing was something wonderful, as well it might be, for in order to master the art of it, he studied singing for 5 years with one of the best teachers of the Italian school, the eminent Garcia. This, however, was later, after he had located in Paris. This trick of treating the melody was not new with Thalberg. It had previously been done upon the harp by the great Welsh virtuoso, Parish Alvars, 1808-1849, whose European reputation had been acquired by a succession of great concert tours, and who at length closed his days in Vienna, where Thalberg lived. There was also an Italian master, Giuseppe Francesco Pollini, 1763-1846, who in 1809 became professor of the piano in the Conservatory of Milan. Pollini had been a pupil of Mozart and dedicated to that great master his first work. Early after being appointed professor, he published a great school for the pianoforte, 1811, in which the art is fully discussed in all its bearings, and minute directions given for touch and all the rest appertaining to a concert treatment of the instrument. He was the first to write piano pieces upon 3 staves, the middle one being devoted to the melody, a proceeding afterward followed in some cases by Liszt and Thalberg. Pollini surrounded his melodies thus placed in the middle of the instrument, where at that time the sonority and singing quality of the pianoforte exclusively lay, with runs and passages of a brilliant and highly ingenious kind. This was done in his Una de 32 esercizi in forma di toccata. But he had already in 1801 published several brilliant pieces in Paris, in which novelties occur. I have never seen a copy of these works of Pollini, nor any other account of them than those in Riemann's dictionary and in Weitzmann's history of the pianoforte, but it is altogether likely that when they are examined we shall find in this case, as in many others of progressive development, that the final result was reached by a succession of steps, each one short and apparently not so very important. The chain of technical development for the piano extended from Bach in unbroken progress, and the discovery of Pollini, who was less known in Western lands than others of the great names in the list, enables us to fill in between Moscheles and Thalberg. Pollini's work anticipates the Clementi Gradus by about 6 years. To return to Thalberg. In 1856 he visited America, where his success was the same as in all other parts of the world. Having accumulated a fortune, he retired from active life and bought an estate near Naples, where he spent the remainder of his life. There were reasons of a purely external and conventional kind why the playing of Thalberg should have attracted more attention, or at least been more admired, than that of Liszt in Paris and in aristocratic circles everywhere. His manner was the perfection of quiet. Whatever the difficulty of the passages upon which he was engaged, he remained perfectly quiet, sitting upright, modestly, without a single unnecessary motion. Moreover, the general character of his passages, which progressed fluently upward or downward by degrees, instead of taking violent leaps from one part of the keyboard to another, permitted him to maintain this elegant quiet with less restriction than would have been possible in such works, for instance, as the great concert fantasias of Liszt. It is to be noticed, further, that the peculiar sonority of Thalberg's playing depended upon the improvements in the pianoforte made just before his appearance and during his career. His method of playing the melody, moreover, while perhaps not distinctly so recognized by him, employed a noticeable element of the arm touch, while his passage work was a ringer movement of the lightest and most facile description. His chords, also, were often struck with a finger touch, and he was perhaps the originator of the peculiar effect produced by touching a chord with the fingers only, but rebounding from the keys with the whole arm to the elbow. A chord thus played has a delicacy peculiar to finger work, but in the removal from the keys the muscles of the arm are called into action in such a way that the finger stroke is intensified to a degree somewhat depending upon the height to which the rebound is carried. Part 4. François Frédéric Chopin, 1809-1849, was one of the most remarkable composers of this epoch, and in some respects one of the most precocious musical geniuses of whom we have any record. He was born at Zelazowa-Wola, a village 6 miles from Warsaw, in Poland, the son of a French merchant living there who had married a Polish lady. Later, in consequence of financial reverses, his father became a teacher in the university. The boy, François, was brought up amid refined and pleasant surroundings, and his education was carefully looked to. Although rather delicate in appearance, he was healthy and full of spirits. His precocity upon the piano was such that at the age of 9 he played a concerto in public with great success, from which time forward he made many appearances in his native city. He early began to compose, and by the time he was 13 or 14 had undertaken a number of works of considerable magnitude. After having received the best instruction which his native city afforded, he started out at the age of 19 for a visit to Vienna, where he appeared in 2 concerts, and to his own surprise was pronounced one of the greatest virtuosi of the day. This, however, is not the point of his precocity. When he started upon his tour to Vienna, he had with him certain manuscripts which he had composed. His opus 2 consisted of variations upon Mozart's air, Lacidarem la mano, of which later Schumann wrote such a glowing account in his paper at Leipzig. These variations were enormously difficult, and in a whole novel style. There were several mazurkas and 3 nocturnes, opus 9, of which the extremely popular one in E-flat stands second, the 12 studies, opus 10, dedicated to Franz Liszt, and a concerto in F minor, and all or nearly all of that in E minor. These were the works of a boy then only 19, the pupil of a comparatively unknown provincial teacher. When we examine these works more minutely, our astonishment increases, for they represent an entirely new school of piano playing. New effects, new managements of the hands, new passages, beautiful melody, exquisitely modulated harmonies. In short, a new world in piano playing was here opened. So difficult and so strange were these works that for nearly a generation the more difficult ones of them were a sealed book to amateur pianists, and even virtuosi like Moscheles declare that they could never get their fingers reliably through them. Much pleased with his success in Vienna, Chopin returned to Warsaw, and after some months set out for London by way of Paris. Here his fortune varied somewhat. At first he found it impossible to secure a hearing, his only acquaintances being a few of his exiled fellow countrymen who were there. At length, one evening, a friend took him to a reception at the Rothschilds', and in this cultivated society he found appreciative listeners to his marvelous playing. From that time on he remained in Paris, only leaving it when his health made it necessary to visit the south of France. He very seldom appeared in public. His touch was not sufficiently strong to render his playing effective in a large hall. The whole of the Chopin genius is summed up in his early works, which he took with him on his visit to Vienna. All his later works are in some sense repetitions. The ideas and the treatment are new, but the principles underlying are the same, and rarely, if ever, does he reach a higher flight than in some of these earlier works. His most celebrated innovation was that of the Nocturne, a sentimental cantilena for the pianoforte, in which a somewhat Byronic sentiment is expressed in a high-bred and elegant style. The name Nocturne was not original with Chopin, the Dublin pianist John Field having published his first nocturnes in 1816. Field himself derived the name from the prayers of the Roman Church, which are made between midnight and morning. The name therefore implies something belonging to the night, mysterious, dreamy, poetic. In Field's there is little of this, aside from the name. The melodies are plain and the sentiments commonplace. With Chopin, however, it is entirely different. In some instances the treatment for the piano is very simple, as in the popular nocturne in E-flat already mentioned, but in other cases he exercises the utmost freedom, and very carefully trained fingers are needed to perform them successfully. This is the case, for example, in the beautiful nocturne in G, Opus 37, number 2, where the passages in thirds and sixths are extremely trying. Also in the very dramatic nocturne in C minor, Opus 48. Chopin's place in the pantheon of the Romantic school is that of the popularizer of pianoforte sentiment. His compositions, by whatever name they may be called, are essentially lyric pieces, songs, ballads, and fanciful stories in rhyme. The subjects are frequently tender or sad, sometimes morbid, in short, Byronic. The treatment is always graceful and high-bred, and the contrasts strong. The melodies are embroidered with a peculiar kind of fioratura, which he invented himself, founded upon the Italian embellishment of that kind, a delicate efflorescence of melody, which, when perfectly done, is extremely pleasing. The names applied to the different compositions, such as ballade, scherzo, prelude, rondo, sonata, impromptu, have only a remote reference to the nature of the piece. Occasionally the entire composition is morbid and unsatisfactory to a degree. These belong to the later period of his life, when he was in poor health. He is a woman's composer. In his strongest moments there is always an effeminate element. In this respect he is exactly opposite to Schumann and Beethoven, whose works, however delicate and refined, have always a manly strength. Chopin made the most important modifications in the current way of treating the piano. In this part of his activity he seemed to realize the possibilities of the instrument in the same way that Paganini had recognized those of the violin. His passages, while based upon those of Hummel, nevertheless produced effects of which Hummel was totally incapable. Chopin is the originator of the extended arpeggio chord, of the chromatic sequences, of the diminished sevenths, with passing notes, and cadenza forms derived from them. He is thoroughly French in his views of changing notes, as for instance in the accompaniment to the impromptu in A-flat, Opus 29. His influence upon the general progress of musical development is to be traced in the works of Liszt, especially in the later pianoforte works, and in a large number of less gifted imitators like Döhler. Part 5. Aside from Wagner, the most remarkable figure of this century is that of Franz Liszt, who was born at Reiding in Hungary, 1811, and died at Bayreuth, 1886. His father, Adam Liszt, was an official in the imperial service, and a musical amateur, capable of instructing his son in piano playing. At the age of 9 he made his first public appearance, with so much success that several noblemen guaranteed the money to enable him to pursue his studies for 6 years in Vienna. Here he became a pupil of Czerny, Salieri, and Randhartinger. He made the acquaintance of Schubert, and upon one occasion played before Beethoven, who kissed him with the prophecy that he would make his mark. His first appearance as a composer was in a set of variations on a waltz by Diabelli, the same for which Beethoven wrote the 33 variations, opus 120. Liszt's variation was the 24th in the set to which Beethoven did not contribute. It was published in 1823, when he was 12 years old. The same year he went to Paris, his father hoping to enter him at the conservatory, in spite of his foreign origin. But Cherubini refused to receive him, so he studied with the other composers. His operetta of Don Sanche was performed at the Académie Royale in 1825 and was well received. At this time he was in the height of his youthful success in Paris, tall, slender, with long hair and a most free and engaging countenance, with ready wit and unbounded tact. He performed marvels upon the piano, such as no one else could attempt. His repertory at this time seems to have consisted of pieces of the old school. In 1827 he lost his father, and being thrown upon his own resources, he began his concert tour. He appeared in London in 1827, his piece being the Hummel concert. 3 years later he played in London again, his number being the Weber Konzertstück. There was something weird and magnetic about his playing. He was very tall, about 6 feet 2 inches, slender, with piercing eyes, very long arms, but small hands. He played without notes, and amid the most frightful difficulties of execution kept his eyes fixed upon this, that, or the other person in the audience. He moved about at the piano very much in the exciting passages, not apparently on account of the difficulty of overcoming technical obstacles, but simply from innate fire and excitement. As for technical difficulties, they did not exist. Everything that the piano contained seemed to be at his service, and the only regret was that the instrument was not better able to respond to his demands. In the fortissimo passages his tone was immense, and his pianissimos were the most delicate whispers. In these his fingers glided over the keys with inconceivable lightness and speed, and the tone fell upon the ear with a delicate tracery with which no particular was lost by reason of speed or lightness. This wonderful control of the instrument stood him in equal stead with his own compositions, especially adapted to his own style of playing, or with the works of the old school, which he transfigured as they had never been played before, or the last sonatas of Beethoven, which at that time were a sealed book to most musicians. These, indeed, he did not play in public, but in private. The essential novelties of the Liszt technique were the bravura cadenzas. The other sensational features, such as carrying the melody in the middle range of the piano with surrounding embroidery, the rapid runs, and the extravagant climaxes, were all more or less common to the three representative virtuoso piano writers of this epoch, Liszt, Chopin, and Thalberg. A careful study of the circumstances and influences surrounding Liszt at the time leads to the conclusion that his ideas of the possibilities of the pianoforte were matured very gradually, not reaching their complete expression in the operatic fantasies before about 1834 or 1835. His early appearances were in pieces of the old school, and there is nothing more to be found in contemporary accounts of his playing than admiration for its superior fire and delicacy. Upon the appearance of Paganini, however, this was changed. The temporary eclipse which this brilliant apparition made of the rising Liszt led him to new studies in original directions. Thus arose the transcriptions of the Paganini Caprices in 1832, and the composition of his own Studies for Transcendent Execution in the same or the following year. Farther sensational improvements were probably the result of the Thalberg contest in Paris during 1835. Liszt's influence may be inferred from such incidents as the following. In 1839 there was a movement on foot to erect a monument to Beethoven at Bonn, but after some months' solicitation the committee found it impossible to realize the desired sum or anything approaching it, whereupon Liszt wrote them to give themselves no further uneasiness, for he himself would be responsible for the entire amount, about $10,000. This large sum he raised by his own exertions and paid over, and a monument was unveiled with brilliant ceremonies in 1845. One of the performances upon that occasion was that of the Beethoven Fifth Concerto, which Liszt himself played. Concerning this memorable performance, Berlioz himself writes, "The piano concerto in E-flat is generally known for one of the better productions of Beethoven. The first movement, and the adagio above all, are of incomparable beauty. To say that Liszt played it, and that he played it in a fashion grand, fine, poetic, yet always faithful, is to make a veritable pleonasm." And there was a tumult of applause, a sound of trumpets and fanfares of the orchestra, which must have been heard far beyond the limits of the hall. Liszt immediately afterward mounted the desk of the conductor to direct the performance of the symphony in C minor, which he made us hear as Beethoven wrote it, including the entire scherzo, without the abridgment, as we have so long been accustomed to hear at the Conservatory at Paris, and the finale with the repeat indicated by Beethoven. I have always had such confidence in the taste of the correctors of the great masters that I was very much surprised to find the symphony in C minor still more beautiful when executed entirely than when corrected. It was necessary to go to Bonn to make this discovery. In 1849 a new epoch was opened in the history of this remarkable man. The Grand Duke of Weimar invited him to assume the direction of his musical establishment, including the opera. The salary was absurdly small, $800 or $1,000 a year. This, however, cut no figure in Liszt's mind, for he had always been singularly open-handed, yet at the same time prudent. For his successful concert tours he had put by funds, 20,000 francs for his aged mother, and 20,000 francs for each of the 3 children he had by the Countess d'Agoult, known in literature as Daniel Stern, and he considered that the position would afford him an opportunity of developing his own talent for composition, and at the same time of affording a hearing for important new works, which, on account of their novelty and originality, were impossible of performance in the theaters of large cities. The repertory of the Weimar opera from this time on was most extraordinary. Here were produced for the first time Wagner's Flying Dutchman, Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, Benvenuto Cellini of Berlioz, Schumann's Genoveva and Manfred, and Schubert's Alfonso and Estrella. Here were produced also the best of the operas of previous generations. Every master work of this sort Liszt revised with the greatest care, giving endless patience to every detail, and supplementing the resources of the theater when insufficient by guests from the great operas in the capital. Thus the musical establishment at Weimar became a sort of Mecca to which all the musicians of the world gathered, especially the young and energetic in the pursuit of knowledge, and creative artists seeking a hearing or fresh inspiration. From an artistic standpoint, nothing more beautiful than the life of Liszt at Weimar could be desired. Besides these operatic performances and his symphony concerts, he gathered about him a succession of young virtuosi pianists. These had lessons, more or less formally, some of them for many years. Liszt never received money for lessons, and took no pupils but those whom he regarded as promising, or who were personally attractive to himself. About 1850 the American Dr. William Mason was there, and for 2 years following. The class at this time contained the well-known names of Rubinstein, Karl Klindworth, Bruckner, Tausig, Joachim Raff, and Hans von Bülow. From this time on there is scarcely a concert pianist in the world who did not spend a few months or longer with Liszt at Weimar. Nor did his influence stop there. He produced a constant succession of important works, and conducted concerts and festivals in Hungary and in different parts of Germany and France. Everywhere his inspiring presence and his keen insight were prized above all ordinary resources. There is not space here to sketch in detail his singular and trying relations to that self-conscious genius, Wagner, who, when absconding to Zurich, sent the score of Lohengrin to Liszt. It can be imagined with what force the elevated and noble beauty of this epoch-making work appealed to a genius so sensitive as Liszt. He not only produced the opera with great care, but prepared the public for it by means of extended articles in important journals in Leipzig, Berlin, and Paris. From this time on, Liszt became the good angel of Wagner. There are few records in the annals of music more creditable than the letters of Liszt to Wagner. He took charge of his business in Germany, exercised his wholly unique and commanding influence to secure performances of Wagner's operas, sent him money out of his own purse, and secured some of his friends. More than this, he greeted every new work of Wagner's with an appreciation as generous and noble as it was intelligent and fine. About 1852 Liszt commenced his symphonic poems. In these he avails himself of 2 of Wagner's suggestions. Much is made of the leading motive, and the orchestration is handled in a sonorous and brilliant manner, which Berlioz and Wagner first introduced. The works are very effective and original. Certain ones of them have become almost classic, like the Preludes and Tasso. He also wrote a number of large choral works, among them his Legend of the Holy Elizabeth, the Grainer Mass, etc. There is hardly a province of musical composition in which Liszt did not distinguish himself. The orchestral compositions number about 20. There are several important arrangements, such as Schubert's marches, Schubert's songs, Rákóczi March, and a variety of arrangements for pianoforte and orchestra, including 2 concertos, the Weber Polacca in E and the Schubert Fantasia. The pianoforte compositions are extremely numerous. Of the original pieces there are perhaps 100. Of important arrangements, such as the Etudes from Paganini, the organ preludes and fugues from Bach, Schubert marches, etc., there are 30 or 40. Of the operatic fantasias there are perhaps 100 or more. There are 15 Hungarian rhapsodies, and a large number of transcriptions of vocal pieces. Of songs alone there are upward of 100. Of masses and psalms about 20. 2 oratorios, several cantatas, about 60 original songs for single voice and piano, and very many other writings of a literary and musical kind. In 1865 Liszt left Weimar for several years and resided in Rome, where he began to take holy orders. In the closing years of Wagner's life, after the Bayreuth Festival Theater had been inaugurated, Liszt was a central figure, and there are few large cities in Europe which he did not visit for the sake of encouraging important productions of the Wagnerian works. Thus, taken as a composer, a performer, a conductor, and an appreciative friend of art, his name is one which deserves to be revered as long as the history of music in the 19th century is remembered. Figure 84 represents him as he appeared in the last years of his life. The portrait of Liszt as abbé is taken from Grove's dictionary. Neither of these last pictures gives an adequate idea of the sweetness of his expression. While the profile in middle life was sharp and clearly cut, as we see it in the Abbé picture, and while in old age the mouth assumed a stern and set expression in repose, his smile was extremely winning, and the habitual expression of his face in conversation one of amiability and kindness. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of A Popular History of the Art of Music from the Earliest Times Until the Present by W.S.B. Mathews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mendelssohn and Schumann, Part 1. One of the most fortunate personalities among modern composers was Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, 1809-1847, who was born in Berlin, the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, the famous Jewish philosopher. The father of Felix was a banker, and his mother a woman of a very sweet and amiable disposition. The children of Abraham Mendelssohn were baptized in the Christian faith in order to escape in some degree the prejudice against the Jewish race. Felix, having a strong inclination to music at an early age, made progress in it. His first concert appearance was made at the age of 10, in which he played the piano part in a trio by Wöfel, and was very much applauded. As early as his 12th year he began systematically to compose, and being naturally of methodical habits, which were still further encouraged by his father and mother, he kept an accurate record of his works, which at the last filled 44 folio volumes, the most of the pieces being dated, and the place given where they were written. In the year 1820 he composed between 50 and 60 movements of almost every sort: songs, part songs, pieces for organ, piano, strings, and orchestra, as well as a cantata and a little comedy for voices and a piano. In the summer of 1820 the whole family made a tour of Switzerland, and a very large number of pieces were composed at this time. In this same year he made a more important concert appearance with Alois Schmidt, in which he played with Schmidt a duet for 2 pianos. This continued exercise in composition was not entirely of an abstract nature, for the Mendelssohn family were accustomed to have reunions on Sunday evenings when these pieces were played. For occasions like this he wrote several small operas, and his talent was encouraged in every way by his parents, and by his very judicious teacher, the celebrated Zelter. When he was scarcely more than 12 years old, Zelter had him play before Goethe, and a trio of the boys was also played, after which he was sent to play in the garden while his seniors discussed his prospects. Thus the boy grew up under the most favorable circumstances possible, his father being a wise and careful man who, although not a musician, thoroughly sympathized with the artistic aims of his son, and his mother also encouraged him to more serious efforts. Even at this early age he was a prolific composer of orchestral music, the year 1824 being that of the composition of the symphony in C minor now known as No. 1, but in Mendelssohn's catalogue marked the 13th of his compositions. In this year Moscheles passed through Berlin on his way to London, and made the acquaintance of Mendelssohn. At the Sunday morning music in the Mendelssohn house, Moscheles recalls the performance of Felix's C minor quartet, D major symphony, a concerto by Bach played by Fanny, and a duet for 2 pianos. In the same year Spohr came to Berlin, and a little later Hiller, both of whom speaking of Mendelssohn's playing as something very remarkable. His celebrated octet for strings, opus 20, was composed in 1825. This was the first of his works which has retained its popularity. The year following he composed the overture to The Midsummer Night's Dream, one of the most remarkable pieces of the early Romantic school. In this, the fairy-like music of Titania and her elves is charmingly contrasted with the folk songs and the absurd bray of the transformed bottom. He had already written an opera, Camacho, which had been submitted to Spontini, the musical director of Berlin, but it was never performed. He entered at the university and attended the lectures of Hegel and Karl Ritter, the geographer, but for mathematics he had no talent. 2 folio volumes of notes of the lectures of Hegel and Ritter are preserved from the years 1827 and 1828. His overture to The Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage was written in 1828. In the year following he started on a long journey of 3 years, carefully planned by his father, in which all the countries of Europe were to have been visited successively, and observations made on civilization and society. His first appearance before an English audience was at a Philharmonic concert May 25, 1828, when he conducted his symphony in C minor and improvised on the piano. He was received with the utmost applause. 5 days later he played the Concertstück of von Weber, and which was a great innovation at that time, with no music before him. His letters from London are very charming indeed. At a concert later, his overture to The Midsummer Night's Dream was performed with great success. This was the beginning of his English popularity, lasting all the rest of his life. The first of his Songs Without Words was published in 1830, having been originally composed for his sister Fanny. In this simple act he opened a new chapter of the literature for the piano. The form of the Song Without Words had already been given in Field's Nocturnes, the first of which were published in 1816, but Mendelssohn, by giving it the title Song Without Words, put the hearer in a different relation to the composition, that of seeking to find in the work a poetic suggestion in addition to the pleasing melody and finely modulated harmony. This also is extremely characteristic of the Romantic epoch, in which music has its origin in poetry. He had already written a number of those charming capriccios, in which the piano is treated with light staccato changing chords, such as von Weber had suggested nearly 20 years earlier in his Moment Capriccio, but which no writer brought to such perfection as Mendelssohn. These 2 styles of pianoforte writing, the fairy-like scherzo and the Song Without Words, are Mendelssohn's specialties, in which no other writer can be compared with him. He also wrote a number of concertos for piano and orchestra, and one for violin, in which these 2 elements are very strong features. Without having the effective passage work of Thalberg, Liszt, or Chopin, or the bold originality of Schumann, Mendelssohn was an extremely original and pleasing pianoforte writer. During his life, especially in the later part of it, he was somewhat overestimated, but at the present time, through the emergence of Schumann from the obscurity into which Mendelssohn's reputation cast him, the works of Mendelssohn are often underestimated. He opened a new chapter in tone poetry, popularizing pianoforte sentiment. The famous G minor concerto for the piano was first produced in Munich in 1831. In the same year he went to Paris, where many of his works were performed and others were composed. The next year he was in London again, when the Hebrides overture was produced and the first book of Songs Without Words was published. He also played the organ at several of the churches, and excited general admiration by his vigorous style. He is said to have been the first to play a Bach pedal fugue in England, certainly the first to play any of the important ones. In 1833 he was settled at Düsseldorf as musical director of the church and 2 associations. There he immediately instituted a reform in the music of the church and in the character of the selections for concert. In the church there were masses by Beethoven and Cherubini, motets by Palestrina, and cantatas by Bach. The next year his oratorio of St. Paul was begun. In 1837 he was married to a very charming lady, Miss Cecilia Jean Renaud, daughter of the clergyman of the Reformed Church at Frankfurt. Very soon after the wedding he was in London and Birmingham, where he conducted St. Paul, and commenced to prepare the libretto for his oratorio of Elijah. Among the Bach fugues which he played in London on the organ at this time were the D major, the G minor, the E major, the C minor, and the short E minor. His pedal playing was very highly esteemed. In 1835 he commenced to conduct the Gewandhaus concerts at Leipzig, and the celebrated conservatory there was founded in 1843. The first professors were Hauptmann, David, Schumann, Pohlenz, and C.F. Becker. Ferdinand David, 1810-1873, was the greatest master of the violin during the third quarter of the century. Moritz Hauptmann, 1792-1868, originally a violinist, was one of the most original theorists of this century. His greatest work, Harmony and Meter, was published in 1853. Soon afterward, Moscheles became associated with them. The city of Leipzig remained his home during the remainder of his life. The founding of the conservatory may have been hastened by certain plans which Mendelssohn had endeavored 3 years before to get adopted in Berlin, where there was a project for founding a royal music school upon a different basis from any at that time existing. From some change in the ministry or temporary political disturbance, the plan fell through, but in Leipzig it was carried out. This famous school, from that time forward, for nearly 50 years, exercised an influence greater than that of any other music school in the world. Among its graduates are a very large number of the most successful teachers and celebrated professional musicians. They had been drawn to Leipzig by the reputation given the conservatory by the possession of such masters as Mendelssohn, Schumann, Hauptmann, Moscheles, Plaidy, Dr. Paul Becker, Brendel, Reinecke, and others. After Mendelssohn's death, indeed, the tradition of his ideas hampered the efficiency of the school to some extent, but very thorough work has always been done there. During his 4 years' connection with the conservatory, Mendelssohn conducted the Gewandhaus concerts and superintended the entire educational operations of the school. In addition to this, he conducted a succession of important festivals in all parts of Europe, producing new works of his own and the greatest works of the masters before him. He made a great reputation as a concert pianist, playing his own concertos and those of Beethoven, as well as the Concertstück of von Weber. Everywhere he improvised upon the organ or the piano, and through all the admiration which he received, remained the same simple, unaffected, sincere artist that he was when a boy. His home life was very happy. In Ferdinand Hiller's Reminiscences, many charming pictures of it are given. The greatest of Mendelssohn's works was Elijah, which was produced at Birmingham, August 26, 1846. Staudigl, the famous baritone of Vienna, was Elijah. The work went extremely well at the first performance, better, Mendelssohn says, than any former work of his. The continual anxiety of producing the new work, the travel, and the many responsibilities belonging to his position finally undermined his health, and at length, November 4th, 1847, he died at Leipzig. It is doubtful whether any musician ever left a warmer or a more distinguished circle of friends than Mendelssohn. In all parts of the musical world, his death was regarded as a calamity. In Elijah and in the first part of St. Paul, Mendelssohn made an addition to the world's stock of oratorios scarcely second to any other works except Handel's Messiah. Elijah, in particular, had the advantage of an extremely dramatic and picturesque story, and a text well selected from the Scriptures. There are many moments in this work of rare and exquisite beauty. The choruses, when contrapuntally developed, have themes somewhat too short, whereby the effect of the words is lost in the intermingling of voices coming in at later moments. But there are other parts of the work which are extremely beautiful. There is a lovely chorus, "He watching over Israel," in which the gentle Mendelssohnian melody is accompanied by soft triplets in the strings, whereby a most delightfully light and spirituel effect is produced. Near the end of the work there is a very graphic recitative to the words, "And one cherub cried to another." Then a soprano voice with grand phrase sings, "Holy, holy is God, the Lord." 3 other soprano voices joining in the last words. These are very lightly accompanied. Immediately thereupon the entire chorus, orchestra, and organ, with the utmost power, come in with the same melody, "Holy, holy is God the Lord." This antiphon being the full chorus, and the female quartet continues in varying style throughout the chorus, and the result is thrilling in the extreme. Extremely dramatic also is the great chorus, "Thanks be to God, for he laveth the thirsty land." There are many solo numbers in the work, all of them remarkable for the care with which the text is treated, and the clearness with which the musical utterance expresses the words. The famous tenor song, "If with all your hearts ye truly seek him," the alto song, "O rest in the Lord," the angel trio, "Lift thine eyes," the great soprano song, "Hear ye Israel," and the bass aria, "It is enough," and especially the prayer of Elijah, "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," are scarcely surpassed in the entire range of oratorio music. There is very remarkable instrumentation also in the scenes on Mount Carmel, and especially at the series of choruses where God the Lord passed by. During his life, Mendelssohn was very highly esteemed as a composer of orchestral music, symphonies, and overtures. While his works in this department contain many beauties, and are carried out with elegant clearness of form, and with that refinement and taste which characterized everything which Mendelssohn did, they have not maintained their reputation at the high level where it formerly stood. It was Mendelssohn's fortune to be one of the masters instrumental in introducing the Romantic school, but upon principle and education he was classical in his taste and instincts, and while his works had a very important use in cultivating an appetite for novelty, whereby the other masters of the Romantic school profited later, he went so short a distance in the new path that the march of events has since left him somewhat behind. Part 2. If it were asked to name the two masters most representative of the 19th century, one could scarcely go amiss, the names of Robert Schumann and Richard Wagner immediately occurring. Robert Schumann, 1810–1856, the son of a very intelligent bookseller, was born at Zwickau in Saxony, and was intended for the law. He received lessons in music at an early age, and his talent was unmistakable. When he was about 11, he accompanied a performance of Friedrich Schneider's Weltgericht. At home, with the aid of some musical companions, he got up performances of musical compositions, and had a small orchestra. He entered at the Leipzig University as a student of law, but devoted the most of his time to playing the piano and to reading Jean Paul, for whom he had a great fondness. He immediately attached himself to the musical circles, entering himself as a pupil with Wieck, the father of his future wife. A year later he transferred his attendance to the University of Heidelberg, attracted thither by the lectures of the famous teacher Thibaut, the same whose work upon the purity of musical art had only recently been published. Here, as in Leipzig, his principal occupation was practicing upon the piano, which he did to the extent of 6 or 7 hours a day. Notwithstanding his fondness for music, his mother was violently opposed to his entering the musical profession, and as his father was now dead, her wishes naturally had much weight. He had already commenced to write songs, quite a number of which belong to the year 1830, when he was living in Heidelberg. He made a tour to the north of Italy, and heard the Italian musician Paganini, which fired him with so much ardor that he immediately set himself to transcribe his caprices for the piano, and to accomplish upon this instrument similar effects to those which Paganini produced upon the violin. At length, after much difficulty with his guardian and his mother, it was agreed that he might fit himself for a musician, so in 1830 he was back again in Leipzig, studying diligently with Master Wieck. In his ardor for great results in a short time, he undertook some kind of mechanical discipline for the fourth finger of his right hand, the effect of which was that the tendons became overstrained, the finger crippled, and for a long time he was utterly unable to use it in piano playing. In composition he now entered upon regular instruction with Heinrich Dorn, at that time conductor of the opera in Leipzig. Dorn recognized the greatness of Schumann's genius, and devoted himself with much interest to his improvement. In 1832 a symphony of his was produced in Zwickau, but apparently with little success, for the work was never heard of afterward. At this same concert Wieck's daughter Clara, who was then 13 years of age, appeared as a pianist, and Zwickau, Schumann says, was fired with enthusiasm for the first time in its life. Already he was very much interested in the promising girl, and expresses himself concerning her with much ardor. He seems to have been singularly slow in composition. At this time, 1833, he had written the first and third movements of the G minor sonata, had commenced the F minor sonata, and completed the toccata, which had been begun 4 years before. He also arranged the second set of Paganini's caprices, opus 10. He found a faithful friend in Frau Voigt, a pianist of sense and ability. Schumann usually passed his evenings in a restaurant in company with his friends, after the German fashion, but while the others talked he usually remained silent. Frau Voigt told W. Taubert that one lovely summer evening, after making music with Schumann, they both felt inclined to go upon the water. They sat side by side in the boat for an hour in silence. At parting, Schumann pressed her hand and said, "Good day. We have perfectly understood one another." The immediate result of the musical associations of Schumann in Leipzig was the project for a musical journal devoted to progress and sincerity. In opera, Rossini was then the ruling force. At the piano, Herz and Hünten, and musical journalism was represented by Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, published by Breitkopf and Hertel, which praised almost everything upon general principles. In 1834, the first number of the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik saw the light. The editors were Robert Schumann, Friedrich Wieck, Ludwig Schunk, and Julius Knorr. Schumann was the ruling power, and he proceeded to develop his literary faculty in a variety of forms. He writes under many pseudonyms, and has much to say about the, quote, David League against the Philistines, close quote, a society existing in his imagination only. One of the famous early articles in this paper was that upon Chopin's variation Lacidarem, greeting the work of the talented young Pole as a production of rare genius. Schumann himself thought so well of this article that he placed it at the beginning of his collected writings. It will be impossible within available limits to define the influence of this journal. During the 10 years when Schumann was editor, many of the most important productions of the modern school first saw light, and all come in for discussion, from a point of view at the same time sympathetic and intelligent. As an example of the musical life at Leipzig in this time, Moscheles mentions an evening in 1835 when Mendelssohn conducted his first concert in the Gewandhaus. The day before this, there had been a musical gathering at Wieck's, at which both Mendelssohn and Schumann were present, perhaps the first time that these two great geniuses were brought together. The next day, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Moscheles, and Banck dined together, and the next day there was music at Wieck's house. Moscheles, Clara Wieck, and L. Reitman from Bremen playing Bach's D minor concerto for 3 pianos, Mendelssohn putting in the orchestral accompaniments on the 4th piano. With Mendelssohn he contracted quite an intimacy. In 1836 he found himself very much devoted to Clara Wieck, and in order to secure a more favorable opening for his career, resolved to transfer himself and the paper to Vienna. But after a year he returned again to Leipzig, and then the course of true love became more difficult, for Papa Wieck was resolutely opposed to the match. But after some months his consent was given, and they were married in 1840. During this year he had an extraordinary activity as a song-writer. The Woman's Love and Life, The Poet's Love, and various other cycles of songs were all produced under the stress of his happy prospects with Clara. It is not easy to ascertain the order of his compositions, since, as we have already seen, the sonatas and some of the other works appearing late in the list of opus numbers were composed very early. The romantic tendency is the most marked of all Schumann's characteristics as a composer. He is above all others the composer of moods. His long pieces are invariably aggregates of shorter ones. The typical forms of Schumann's thought are two, and two only, the song and the fantasia. He made diligent efforts to master counterpoint and fugue, and manly attempts in these provinces can be found among his writings. But counterpoint and fugue remained to him a foreign language. The smoothness of Mendelssohn, the readiness of Bach, of Beethoven, or even Mozart are impossible to him. On the other hand, when he follows his own inclination, he creates forms that are clear, concise, and original. One scarcely knows which to admire more, the graphic correspondence of the music with the suggestive title placed at the head, or the original style of the music itself, which is entirely unlike anything by any former composer. His opus 2 is a set called Papillons, Butterflies, or Scenes at a Ball, consisting of 12 short movements in different style, without explanatory titles. Some are fantastic, others are sentimental, all original and striking. The 11th number of this is a short but magnificent polonaise in D major, an extremely spirited and beautiful movement which has since been very popular. The transcriptions of the Paganini caprices were undertaken as studies for the composer himself in the direction of unexplored pianoforte effects. But Schumann had also the intention of providing in music new discipline for piano students. In my opinion, the technical value of these works has not yet been realized, and it is quite possible that a later generation may esteem them more highly than the present. However this may be, the practice of writing gave Schumann a greater freedom, the effect of which is seen upon the next set of pieces, the 6 intermezzi. These, however, are vague and mystical rather than clear. With the David's League dances, the Schumann nature appears more plainly. The style is freer, and these new combinations are very charming, although they must undoubtedly have been fatal stumbling blocks to the fingers of a pianist trained in Dussek and Hünten. The Carnival, a series of fanciful scenes, belongs to an earlier period, having been composed in 1834 and 1835. The different numbers, of which there are 21, are provided with explanatory titles, such as Pierrot, Harlequin, Valse Noble, Eusebius, Chopin, etc. Of all the earlier works, the fantasy pieces opus 12 are the most successful. These 8 pictures, In the Evening, Soaring, Why, Whims, In the Night, Fable, Dreams, and The End of the Song, or peroration, are extremely characteristic and beautiful, and it is not easy to assign the preeminence of one number over the others. Of the same general class, only upon a smaller scale, are the Scenes from Childhood, opus 15, of which there are 13 little pieces, each with an explanatory title, such as Playing Tag, Happy Enough, Dreams, parentheses, Traumerei. In this direction Schumann often composed at a later period of his life. There is the Album for the Young, opus 68, containing 43 short pieces, all with titles. The 20 Album Leaves, opus 124, and the Forest Scenes, with titles like The Entrance, The Hunter on the Lookout, Solitary Flowers, Prophetic Bird, Hunting Song, etc. Schumann's greatness as a composer for the pianoforte, both from a technical and poetic standpoint, is shown in such works as the Étude symphonique, the Kreisleriana, and the Concerto in A minor. The first of these works is regarded by many as the most satisfactory of any of this author's works. It consists of an air, 9 variations, and a finale, which is in rondo form. The variations, however, are fantasies rather than variations, the theme itself appearing very little in any of them, and in some of them not at all. It would be impossible to find within the same compass a similar number of pages covering so wide a range of beautiful pianoforte effects and highly suggestive and poetic music. In the Fantasia in C, Schumann's fancy takes on a more serious mood. He treats the piano with great freedom, requiring of the player a powerful touch and much refinement of tone color, as well as a style of technique which he himself has largely created. The second movement of this, the March Tempo, represents Schumann's imagination in a forcible light in 2 directions, its bold, strong moods, and its deeply subjective, meditative activity. The Kreisleriana consists of 8 fantasies named after an old schoolmaster near Leipzig, noted for his eccentricities. This work was coldly received when first produced, but later has become very popular. The best movements are the first and second, but the entire work is strong. The Concerto in A minor is by no means a showpiece for the piano, but an extremely vigorous and poetic improvisation, in which the solo and orchestral instruments answer each other and work together in a furor of inspiration. The entire art of modern piano playing is indebted to Schumann for some of its most impressive elements. He was fond of playing with the dampers raised, and might well contest the honor with Liszt of having originated the modern style of pedal legato, as distinguished from the finger legato of Chopin and all the early writers. He seems to have discovered the touch which Mason called elastic, that made by shutting the hand and at the same time allowing the wrist to remain flexible. In quite a number of his pieces this effect is very marked, as the first number of Kreisleriana, the first of the night pieces, and especially the fourth of these, where the chords are purposely spread beyond the octave in order to necessitate their being struck with the finger and arm touch combined in the same manner as that illustrated on a larger scale in the 11th study of Chopin's Opus 10. Indeed, if one were to attempt to characterize the Schumann technique by some one of its more prominent features, the free use of the arm would be perhaps the one best representing the depth and sonority of tone required for these effects. But while Schumann demands broad, deep, elastic tone color for the stronger moments in his work, there is no other writer so desirous as he of the soft, full, mysterious tone, representing what he was fond of calling innigkeit (inwardness). There are many minor mannerisms which have been diligently cultivated by later composers, the most prominent among them being perhaps what might be called the accompaniment upon the off-beat. In many of his works, Schumann occupies the middle ground of the piano with soft chords which are felt rather than heard, and which always come in upon the half-beat or the quarter-beat, and rarely or never upon the full accented part of a measure. The differentiation of the melody from its harmonic and rhythmic background is accomplished by this great master in a beautiful manner. Take, for instance, the Romanze in F sharp, opus 28, number 2. The melody of the first strophe of this exquisite music might have been written for church. It is a duet for baritones, the voices being represented by the thumbs of the player. Against this melody, the quarter notes and eighths, there is an accompaniment in sixteenths, covering 2 octaves and a third, the entire effect being soft and distant. In the second strophe, the soprano voice takes the melody, which is supported by rare harmonies and a lovely figuration in the alto. The third strophe brings back again the principal subject, and a splendid climax is made, after which an elaborate coda concludes the work. It is impossible to play this lovely piece with good effect without the Schumann technique. Played with the Mozart technique, it would be simply insipid, and with a Beethoven technique, it would still be dry and harsh. It is only by the combination of the arm touch for the melody, the very obscure, unobtrusive finger touch for the accompaniment, and the constant use of the pedal for promoting blending of tones, that the vague and poetic atmosphere of this piece can be realized. Schumann might also be credited with the invention of a new style of composition or of music thinking. The element of canonic imitation occurs in his works in wholly new form. A single phrase or motive is repeated through nearly an entire movement in 1,000 different forms and transformations, so that the whole movement is made up from this single germ, and yet with such mastery of rhythm and of harmony as to conduct the thought to a powerful climax without any impression of monotony interfering with it. One can hardly go amiss in the large works of Schumann for illustrations of this style of composition. Take, for example, the Novelette in B minor, opus 99, the Novelette in E major, opus 21, number 7, the first of the Kreisleriana, and many other parts of the same work. This style I have elsewhere called the thematic, as distinguished from the lyric, in which a flowing melody is a distinctive trait. Beethoven, in a number of cases, employs a style of thought development somewhat similar, but the results accomplished are tamer than with Schumann. One of the most striking examples is found in the finale of the Sonata in D minor, opus 31, number 2, and in the first movement of the Sonata in C minor, opus 111. In this point of view, Schumann appears as the predecessor of Wagner, who almost certainly took his departure for thematic work from Schumann. If it were not for these numerous, highly poetic, and masterly compositions for pianoforte solo, and for the chamber pieces, the symphonies, and other large works, Schumann would have been entitled to a very eminent place among composers by his songs alone. These are as different as possible from those of previous writers, excepting Schubert, and the voice itself is not always well considered in them, but there are no other works in this department in which the poetic sentiment is so thoroughly reproduced in the music as Schumann has done it in his Woman's Love and Life, and in Poet's Love, and in many single songs of other sets. The Spring Night being a very marked example. If the future should chance to produce a race of poetic and intelligent singers, these songs will be found among the most effective which the whole literature of music can show. Some of them are already well and favorably known in all parts of the world. The excellencies of Schumann as a songwriter are only in part reproduced in his larger works, in the form of cantatas, and in the opera of Genoveva. He was without the technique of chorus construction, and writes injudiciously for voices in mass. His instrumentation, although graphically conceived, is not cleverly worked out, in consequence of which we find in such works as The Pilgrimage of the Rose, Paradise and the Peri, the Faust music, and the opera of Genoveva some extremely brilliant suggestions and contrasts, and occasionally fine moments intermingled with many others which fail for want of technical skill in the use of the performing material. The same restriction may be applied to the orchestral and chamber works, in spite of the inherent force and beauty of the ideas they contain. In the symphony, for example, he writes badly for the violins, the very soul of the orchestra. The phrases are short, staccato notes abound, and scarcely in an entire score have the violinists the long, sustained phrases, where the singing power of this beautiful instrument appears. The best of the chamber pieces are those in which the piano is the principal instrument, especially the great quintet. This is a master work of a very high order, and while the strings do not have the consideration that belongs to them, the pianoforte is treated with so much freedom and power as in a great measure to compensate for this lack. Of the Schumann works as a whole, the most striking characteristic is the spontaneous, improvistic effect. Every Schumann piece, that is to say, every successful Schumann piece, has the character of an improvisation, in which the power and fancy of the composer are as marked as his deep tenderness and sentiment, fine instinct for poetic effect, and a delicate ear for tone color. For this reason, the popular appreciation of the Schumann works upon a large scale is only a question of an educated generation. There are many indications of progress in this direction on the part of musical amateurs the world over. In Schumann's lifetime, and immediately after his death, the neglect of his compositions was extreme. Dr. William Mason narrates that when he visited Leipzig in 1850, one of the first symphonies he heard was Schumann's in B-flat, the first composition of this writer he had ever heard. The beauty and force of the work took complete possession of him. A new world of tone was opened to him. He dreamed of the Schumann symphony all night, and at early morning went down to Breitkopf and Hertel's to inquire whether this man Schumann had written anything for the piano. The salesman laid before him a few dusty compositions off the shelves. The young American asked, "Is that all?" More were produced. "Is that all?" he asked again, whereupon the salesman, discovering that he had a Schumann enthusiast to deal with, took advantage of the moment, and in the cellar showed him whole editions of Schumann pianoforte pieces tied up in bundles, exactly as they had come from the printers. Liszt, in some of his earlier concerts, attempted to patronize the Schumann compositions. Their style, however, was so different from the sensationalism of his own pieces or the sentiment of Chopin that the public failed to appreciate them, and the pianist dropped them. Nevertheless, there were reasons why Liszt ought to have played these works. The Schumann technique is not sensational like that of Liszt, but it has with it one element in common, already referred to, the pedal legato, and no pianist at that time was so well prepared to recognize and interpret this element as Liszt, if he had realized his opportunity. In person, Schumann was of medium height, inclining to corpulency, with a very soft and gentle walk, and a most invincible habit of silence. Old residents of Leipzig remember his visits to the rehearsals at the Gewandhaus, where for a whole evening he would sit with his handkerchief held over his mouth, never speaking a word to anyone from the beginning to the end, and going away as silently as he came. Nevertheless, it was universally recognized that upon these occasions Schumann heartily enjoyed himself, and to use his own words again, he and the music perfectly understood one another. His mind was intensely active and fanciful. This is seen in all his pieces. The rapidity of the musical thought, the strong contrasts of mood, the proximity of remote chords and modulations are all indications of this mental trait. It was this also which finally destroyed him. His mind became unbalanced, and after intermittent attacks of melancholy, his life ended with 2 years' almost entire oblivion of reason. In spite of his comparative unpopularity in his own day, no one of the Romantic masters has left so strong an impression upon the composers who came after him. In my opinion, the 4 great names which have been most operative in establishing forms of musical thought and in creating wholly original and highly poetic and masterly tone poems by means of those forms are Bach, Beethoven, Schumann, and Wagner, and each one of the earlier masters has in his work the prophecy of most of the qualities of those who come after, while each of the later reflects the characteristic traits of his predecessors. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of A Popular History of the Art of Music from the Earliest Times Until the Present by W.S.B. Mathews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Italian Opera during the 19th Century. The strongest personality of the Italian composers, though by no means the loveliest, at the beginning of the 19th century was that of Gasparo Spontini, 1774-1851. He was born of peasant stock in the Roman states and educated at Naples, where his boyish successes were made. In 1803 he went to Paris, where he composed several operas with very poor success. Nevertheless, having full confidence in his own powers, he was not discouraged, and in 1804 his one-act opera of Milton was performed successfully at the Théâtre Feydeau. He had already begun his La Vestale, which was brought out in 1807 and immediately achieved a remarkable success. Spontini was appointed compositeur particulier to the Empress Josephine, in spite of which an oratorio of his was hissed from the stage in Holy Week of the same year that his Vestale had been so favorably received. The popularity of the Vestal continued to grow, so that it had been performed more than 200 times in Paris before 1824. In Italy and Germany, where its career began in 1811, its popularity was similar. His next opera was Fernand Cortez, 1809, afterward materially improved. These 2 works mark the highest point reached by Spontini. They are brilliant, martial, vigorous, and spectacular, and the legitimate predecessors of the Meyerbeer grand operas. Spontini's smaller works failed, and in 1819 negotiations were concluded with King William III, who had been impressed with La Vestale when he had visited Paris, whereby for 20 years Spontini was made Director General of the opera in Berlin. In this position he produced a number of other works, the best being Nur Mahal, 1822, Alcidor, 1825, and Agnes von Hohenstaufen, 1829. Spontini was a vigorous director, but unprincipled, vain, and narrow. Nevertheless, at his concerts he produced the 5th and 7th symphonies of Beethoven for the first time in Berlin, as well as parts of the great Bach Mass in B minor, and much other great music. Opposition to his tyranny culminated in 1842 by his dismission from the directorship, Meyerbeer being his successor. His popularity paled from the production of Weber's Der Freischütz in 1821. Spontini died in his native town of Majolitat. The Italian composer most famous in the earlier part of the century was Gioacchino Antonio Rossini, 1792-1868, a native of Pesaro, a small town on the Adriatic. After a short course at the Conservatory of Verona, the boy commenced to compose, and no less than 13 short pieces preceded his first really popular opera, Tancredi, which was produced at La Fenice in Venice in 1813. The success of this work led to many others, among which the best known are The Italian in Algiers, The Turk in Italy, and in 1816 no less than 5 operas in 1 year, Torvaldo e Dorlisca, The Barber of Seville, La Gazzetta, and Otello. His first serious opera he composed with the utmost facility. The Barber, one of the most successful operas ever performed, and one of Rossini's works which bids fair to outlast the rest, was composed and mounted within a month. For this work he received £80 sterling. It was not at first successful. In 1823 he brought out Semiramide, which was only moderately successful at first. The next turn in Rossini's fortune found him in London, where he had accepted an engagement with the manager of King's Theatre, and here he produced a number of his former works with moderate success. Rossini himself appeared upon the stage and sang the solos in a cantata which he had composed in honor of the king, George IV. He turned many honest pennies during his London engagement by acting as accompanist at private soirées for a fee of £50. At the end of 5 months he found himself in possession of £7,000, with which he made a graceful retreat to Paris, where he accepted the musical direction of the Théâtre Italien at the salary of £800 per year. This was in 1826. After the expiration of his engagement at this theatre, several of his works were produced at the Grand Opera, among which were The Siege of Corinth and Moïse. March 27, 1827. This work, which is given in England as an oratorio, was a revised edition of his opera of Mose, which he had written for Naples 5 years before. The most taking number in it is the famous prayer, which has been played and sung in every form possible for a popular melody. The operatic career of Rossini ended in 1829 with the production of his opera of William Tell at the Paris Académie, with a brilliant cast. In this work he forswears florid writing and makes a serious effort at dramatic characterization. The opera is extremely melodious, and a very great advance over any of his former productions. Having now accumulated a fortune, he retired from the stage and lived the remainder of his life near Paris in elegant leisure, composing a solemn mass and a few other sacred works, but no other operas. In reviewing the career of this singularly gifted Italian melodist, it is impossible to resist the conclusion that his talents were worthy of a nobler development. Among his sacred works, the Stabat Mater is the most popular. It contains some very beautiful chromatic writing, and is really an artwork of a distinguished merit. His latest work was the Messe Solennelle, 1864. Rossini was fond of good living, very witty in conversation, and his house was frequented by the most brilliant wits and the best artists of the 30 years between William Tell and his death. Upon the whole, the most brilliant master of Italian opera during this period was Gaetano Donizetti, 1797-1848, who was born at Bergamo and educated at Naples. His first opera was produced in Vienna in 1818, but his first complete success was Anna Bolena, which was written for Milan in 1830, the principal parts having been taken by Pasta and Rubini. Soon after this followed L'Elisir d'Amore, 1832, Lucia di Lammermoor, Naples, 1835, Lucrezia Borgia, 1834, Belisario, 1836, Poliuto, 1838, La Fille du Régiment, 1840, La Favorita, Linda di Chamounix, 1842, Don Pasquale, 1843. Besides these well-known works, there were many others, the total number reaching 63, brought out in various Italian theaters and in Paris. Donizetti's traits as a composer are pleasant melody, effective concerted pieces, as for instance the sextet in Lucia, which is perhaps the best concerted piece in Italian opera, and a good constructive ability. Like Rossini, he was a writer of florid music, and Lucia remains one of the favorite numbers of coloratura singers to the present day, which, considering that more than 50 years have intervened since it was composed, is a great compliment. Vincenzo Bellini, 1802-1835, was born at Catania in Switzerland, the son of an organist. He was educated at Naples under Zingarelli, his first opera having been composed in 1826, while he was still a member of the Conservatory. It was Bianca e Fernando, produced at San Carlos. His next work, Il Pirata, was written for La Scala in Milan, the tenor part having been especially designed for the celebrated Rubini. Among the other successful operas of this composer were I Capuletti e I Montecchi in 1830, La Sonnambula, 1831, at La Scala, Norma, and I Puritani. It was this latter work which contains a brilliant duet for two basses, Suona la tromba, of which Rossini wrote from Paris to a friend at Milan, "It is unnecessary for me to write of the duet for two basses. You must have heard it." Bellini was essentially a melodist, a lyric composer of idealic naivete. Of dramatic power he had very little. His orchestration is simple, although frequently very sonorous. If he had lived to the age of Donizetti or of Rossini, it is not impossible that much greater works would have emanated from his pen, for in his next great successor we have an example of such a growth under conditions less favorable than those promised in Bellini's case. The most vigorous of all the Italian composers of this epoch is Giuseppe Verdi, who was born at Roncole October 9th, 1813, his father having been a small innkeeper. The boy was of a quiet, melancholy character, with one passion, music. And when he was 7 years of age, his father purchased a spinet for his practice. When he was 10 years old, he was appointed organist of the church in his native town. At this time, his necessary expenditures amounted to about $22 per year, and his salary as organist $7.20, which, after many urgent appeals, was increased to $8. In addition, he had certain perquisites from weddings and funerals amounting to about $10 per year. In this way he continued until he was 16, having by this time become conductor of a philharmonic society and the composer of quite a number of works at the little town of Dusetto. He went to Milan, where he was refused admission to the conservatory on the ground of his showing no special aptitude for music. Nevertheless, he persevered in his chosen vocation, receiving lessons from Rolla, the conductor of La Scala. He studied diligently for 2 years, Mozart's Don Giovanni being a part of his daily exercise. After this, he returned for 5 years to his country life, and by the time he was 25 he was back again in Milan, in the hope of securing the performance of his opera Oberto. This for quite a long time he was unable to do, but at length, in 1839, it was performed at La Scala. The moderate success of this work secured him an engagement to produce an opera every 8 months for Milan or Vienna. But his first work, a comic opera which the managers demanded, Un giorno di regno, was a dead failure, and disgusted the composer to such a point that he declared that he would never write again. At this time Verdi was the victim of most severe affliction. In addition to poverty, within the space of about 2 months he experienced the loss of his 2 children and of his wife, to whom he was devotedly attached. After living some time in Milan, he received a copy of the libretto Il Proscritto, and in 1842 it was performed. It was well staged, and achieved an unqualified success. Then followed I Lombardi, 1843, Ernani, 1844, I Due Foscari, 1844, Attila, 1846, Macbeth, 1847, Rigoletto, 1851, Il Trovatore, 1853, La Traviata, 1853, Les Vepres Sicilienes, 1855, Un ballo in maschera, 1859, La forza del destino, 1862, Don Carlos, 1867, Aida, 1871, Otello, 1887. In addition to these works, he has written a great requiem mass and many smaller works. Besides the operas above mentioned, there were several others now mostly forgotten, the total number being 29, and there is not one of them that does not contain more or less of striking melody, with effective concerted pieces and choruses. Verdi's melody was much more vigorous than that of either of his predecessors. In Trovatore there are 10 or 12 numbers which have become famous in the barrel organ repertory. His instrumentation was very full and sonorous, and his dramatic instinct excellent. We do not find the long roulades and ornamental passages according to the taste of his predecessors, but instead of them, clear, sharp, concise, manly melodies. Unfortunately, however, they are so near the line of the vulgar that only a refined treatment on the part of the singer can save them for poetry and beauty. Beginning with Aida, a very important change can be seen in Verdi's style. By the time this work was undertaken, the Wagnerian theories were attracting general attention, and it was impossible that a man of Verdi's intellectual force should have failed to be affected by them. Aida is much more refined and dramatically truthful than any of those before it. As the composer was now an old man, nothing farther was expected from his pen. Nevertheless, in Otello he has given the world a masterpiece of a still higher order, the music throughout being subservient to the story, while the dramatic handling of the work is masterly in the extreme. For this he was in part indebted to his librettist, the distinguished poet and composer Signor Arrigo Boito. The strangest thing in regard to Verdi is that at the present writing, 1891, he is engaged upon a comic opera, Falstaff, a subject which he says has interested him for about 40 years, but which until now he has never had time to undertake. As a man and a patriot, Verdi is held in the highest possible honor in Italy, and for his own original genius, as displayed in his works, and especially in his aptitude for progress, no less than for his dignified and simple private life, he deserves to be admired as the foremost Italian master of the present century. One of the most earnest among Italian composers and musicians is Arrigo Boito, 1842, who from an origin which is German from his mother's side, possesses an earnestness and force in music not usual in southern lands. After composing 2 cantatas which had a good success, his grand opera of Mefistofele was produced at Milan in 1868 and later in other leading cities. 2 more operas, Hero and Leander and Nero, are not yet published. Monsieur Boito is equally celebrated in his own country as musician and as poet. In the latter capacity he prepared his own librettos, besides furnishing that of Otello to Verdi and La Gioconda to Ponchielli. He has published several books of poems and other operatic works. As composer he partakes much of the spirit of Wagner. He has yet another opera nearly completed, but in 1891 little is known of it. It is called Orestiade. Amilcare Ponchielli, 1834-1866, is generally regarded in Italy as having been the most distinguished Italian composer after Verdi. He was educated at Milan, but his early triumphs were made elsewhere, his famous I Promessi Sposi having been performed there only in 1872. His principal works are the preceding, which was composed in 1856, La Savoiarda, 1861, Roderico, 1864, La Stella del Monte, 1867, La Gioconda, his masterwork produced at La Scala, 1876, and Marion dell'Orme, 1885. His music occupies a middle ground between the melodiousness of the Italian composers of the early part of the century and the seriousness of later German opera. In spite of the few examples reaching foreign countries, there is a continuous and rather abundant production of light and serious operas in Italy, every principal theater making it a point to bring out one or more new works every season. The best of these, after a long interval, become known abroad. It is a great mistake to suppose that the few Italian operas of recent date performed in England and America adequately represent the present state of Italian art. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of A Popular History of the Art of Music from the Earliest Times Until the Present, by W.S.B. Mathews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. French operatic composers of the 19th century. In the earlier part of the 19th century, the operatic stage of Paris shared with those of Berlin and Dresden the honor of producing brilliant novelties by the best composers. In France, there had been a persistent cultivation of this province of musical creation, and many talented composers have appeared upon the scene of the grand opera and that of the opéra comique. French opera has developed into a genre of its own, rhythmically well regulated, instrumented in a pleasing and attractive manner, and staged with considerable reference to spectacular display. The oldest of these masters to achieve distinction, and the one most successful in gaining the ear of other countries than France, was Daniel François Esprit Aubé, 1782-1870. He was born in Caen, in Normandy, of a family highly gifted and artistic in temperament. Nevertheless, his father intended him for a merchant, and sent him to England in 1804 in the hope that the study of commercial success there might wean him from his love of music. But the boy came back more musical than ever. After composing several pieces, a little opera, a mass, etc., his first opera to be publicly performed was Le Séjour Militaire. During the 15 years next following, he wrote a succession of light operas for the smaller theaters of Paris, most of them with librettos by Scribe. No one of these works had more than a temporary success, and the names are not sufficiently important to be given here. At length, in 1828, he produced his masterwork, La Muette di Portici, otherwise known as Masaniello, which at once placed its author upon the pinnacle of fame. This was an opera upon the largest scale, and was the first in order of the three great master works which adorned the Paris stage during this and the 3 years following. The others were Rossini's Tell in 1829 and Meyerbeer's Robert in 1831. The subject was fortunately related to the spirit of the times, Masaniello having been leader of the insurgents in Naples. The work well deserved its success, since for melody and pleasing effects it has rarely been surpassed. The overture is still much played as a concert number, but the opera itself has nearly left the stage, excepting in Germany, where it still has a distinguished place. All his later works were lighter than Masaniello. They were La Fiancée, 1829, the extremely melodious and popular Fra Diavolo, 1830, and many others, for more than 20 years still. Among them were The Bronze Horse in 1835, Le Domino Noir in 1837, and The Crown Diamonds, 1831. Aubé was elected member of the Institute in 1829, and in 1842 succeeded Cherubini as director of the conservatory. He was an extremely witty and charming man, beloved by all. Contemporaneous with Aubé, but more allied to the genius of Boieldieu, was Louis-Joseph Ferdinand Hérold, 1791-1833. After studying at the conservatory and composing a number of operas which failed or had but moderate success, he brought out Zampa in 1831. This work had an extraordinary success, and its overture is still often heard. Another work, Le Pré aux Clercs, 1832, is generally esteemed in France more highly than Zampa, but outside his native country public opinion universally regards the latter as his best work. Hérold's operas are extremely well conceived from a dramatic point of view, and his melody has much of the sweet and flowing quality of the best Italian. His concerted numbers also are well made, and in all respects he is to be regarded as a master of high rank within the province of light opera, verging indeed upon the confines of the romantic type, like that of Weber. The true successor of Boieldieu, with perhaps somewhat less of originality, was Adolphe Charles Adam, 1803-1856, son of a piano teacher in the conservatory at Paris. His most lasting work was Le Postillon de Longjumeau, 1836, in which the German tenor Wachtel made himself so famous. Most of the other productions of this clever but not deep composer are now forgotten. In their day they pleased. The most important work of the last half-century of French opera was the Faust of Charles-François Gounod, 1818, produced in 1859. Gounod was born and educated at Paris, took the prize of Rome in 1837, after composing quite a number of works of a semi-religious character, in which direction he has always had a strong bias. His first opera was produced in 1854, La Nonne Sanglante. In 1852 he was made director of the Orphéonistes, the male part singers of Paris, numbering many thousands, somewhat answering to the organization of the tonic sol fa in England. Faust made an epoch in French opera. Its rich and sensuous music, its love melodies of melting tenderness, and the cleverness of the instrumentation, as well as its pleasing character, combine to place it in a category by itself. This was the beginning and the end of Gounod, for in his other works, while there is much cleverness and melodiousness, there is also much reminder of Faust. Perhaps the best of his later operas are Roméo et Juliette, 1867, and Mireille, 1864. Among the others were Saint-Mars, Polyeucte, Le Tribut de Zamora. He has also written an oratorio, The Redemption, produced at Birmingham in 1882, many numbers in which are truly imposing. As a whole, the work is mystical and sensuous rather than strong or inspired. A continuation of this work, Mors et Vita, was given at Birmingham in 1885, and the following year several times in America under the direction of Mr. Theodore Thomas. In this work, a part of the text of which consists of the Latin hymn Dies Irae, Gounod contrives to repeat certain of the sensational effects of Berlioz's work. Both these oratorios belong to an intermediate category in oratorio, sensational effects possible only in the concert room, intervening with others planned entirely in a devotional and mystic spirit. As a composer, Gounod has two elements of strength. He is first of all a lyrical composer of unusual merit, as can be seen in his "Oh, that we two were Maying," "Nazareth," "There is a green hill far away," etc. His second element of greatness is his talent for well-sounding and deliciously blending instrumentation, in which respect he is one of the best representatives of the French school. This quality is happily shown upon a small scale in connection with the other already mentioned in his famous Ave Maria, with violin and organ obbligato superimposed upon the first prelude in Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. Unfortunately, his structural ability is not equal to the strain of elaborate dramatic works, in which the interest greatly depends upon the music following the complications of the drama. In Faust, and in all his other operas, the songs are the main attraction, the songs and the choruses. The finales are poorly constructed, with little invention and less progress of dramatic intensity. Among the better composers of the later French school was Félix Marie Victor Massé, 1822 to 1884, who experienced the usual fortunes of the better class of French composers, having taken the prize of Rome in 1844 and produced his first opera, La Chanteuse Voilée, in 1850, which was followed by his Galatea in 1852 and The Marriage of Jeanette in 1853. Encouraged by these successes, he produced a large number of operas in Italy, of which the best were La Reine Topaz, 1856, and Les Saisons, 1855. In 1860 he became chorus master at the Academy of Music, and in 1866 professor of composition at the Conservatory. In 1872 he was elected to the Institute as successor of Aubé. In addition to the works already mentioned, he produced Paul and Virginia, 1866, and several others, besides a number of songs. His last opera, Le Mort de Cléopâtre, was written during his long sickness, and on the whole was not a success. Another pleasing French composer is Jules-Émile Frédéric Massenet, 1842, who took the prize of Rome in 1863 and in 1867 produced his first opera, La Grande Tante. In addition to this, he composed a number of operas, Le Roi de Lahore, 1877, Marie Madeleine, 1873, an oratorio, and Ève in 1875. He has also written a number of orchestral suites, which have been very popular in all countries. His latest work, L'Hommage, was produced at the Grand Opera, Paris, March 1891. One of the most brilliant and versatile of the French musicians of this generation is Monsieur Camille Saint-Saëns, 1835, a virtuoso upon the piano and organ, and an orchestral tone poet of very rare quality. Educated in the conservatory, he composed his first symphony when he was 16 and was organist of the Church of Sainte Marie at the age of 18. In 1858 he became organist at the Madeleine. He has produced a number of operas, of which Le Timbre d'Argent, 1887, Samson and Delilah, 1877, and Etienne Marcel, 1879. Henry VIII, 1883, and Ascanio, produced in 1890 at the Grand Opera. In addition to these, Saint-Saëns has produced a large number of orchestral pieces, including Le Muet d'Omphale, Le Danse Macabre, and other symphonic poems of the program character. He has also written several oratorios, of which The Deluge is the most important, and a large amount of chamber and pianoforte music. He is a brilliant writer about music. He is favorably known in Germany and all the rest of Europe as a virtuoso upon the piano and organ. His second concerto for piano is one of the best virtuoso pieces for that instrument. In his Mélodie et Harmonie, a collection of newspaper essays, he discusses many interesting questions. His fame with posterity is more likely to rest upon his orchestral pieces, which are extremely clever and interesting, than upon his operas. Personally, he is said to be very witty and entertaining. He has been a member of the Institute since 1874. Another French composer, versatile and well gifted in orchestral composition, is Clément Philibert Léo Delibes, 1848. After his education at the Conservatory and his service as an accompanist at the Grand Opera, he received in 1866 a commission to compose a ballet, La Source, in which he displayed such a wealth of melody and such fortunate rhythm that his talent was henceforth unmistakable. He has since composed a large number of ballets, many of which are known in all parts of the world, such as Sylvia, also a large number of songs. His principal opera was Lakmé, 1883. He is a professor at the Conservatory, a member of the Legion of Honor, and the successor of Victor Massé at the Institute. Still another very talented composer of orchestral music is Édouard Victor Antoine Lalo, 1823, who was originally a violinist in a favorite string quartet. He has composed a large amount of orchestral music, a violin concerto in F, 1874, Symphonie Espagnole, 1875, for violin and orchestra, a rhapsody, Norvégienne, and many other orchestral works, besides several operas, of which the Roi d'Ise, 1888, is the most important. He received the Cross of the Legion of Honor in 1880 and is one of the best of the French composers. Many of his works have been played by Theodore Thomas. Georges Bizet, 1838-1875, is best known as the composer of Carmen, 1875. He had previously produced a considerable number of smaller works, which had been but moderately successful. In Carmen, however, he showed qualities of rhythmic and harmonic coloration which promised brilliant results in the future. His career was prematurely cut short by death. He was a fine pianist. The Nestor of still living French composers is Monsieur Charles Ambroise Thomas, 1811, born at Metz in the same year as Liszt, and only 1 and 2 years after Schumann and Chopin. This venerable and highly gifted master early succeeded in catching the ear of the French public, and between 1837, when his La Double Échelle was performed at the Opéra Comique, until 1848, he produced a succession of charming light pieces in the taste of the day. There was a sort of middle period in which he wrote several very witty works for the same stage, but the time of his greatest career dates from the production of Mignon, 1866, Hamlet, 1868, and Francesca da Rimini, 1882. He was elected to the Institute in 1851, and at Auber's death in 1871 was made director of the Conservatoire, in which important position he has accomplished much toward systematizing and deepening musical education. Monsieur Thomas is a highly cultivated man of the world, tall, slender, fond of physical exercise. He has retained the faculties of an active and very versatile mind to an old age. His opera of Mignon is probably the one of his productions which will last longest. Of French opera as a whole during this century, the general characterization may be made that it has gained in cosmopolitan quality, nearly all the composers mentioned in the present chapter having gained a world-wide fame. The distinguishing feature of this class of opera is its sprightly rhythm and the clearness of the melodic forms. The instrumentation also is generally clever. The music is pleasing rather than deep, and the popularity of French opera in Germany, for example, is mainly due to its value as a relief to the often undue elaboration of the original German article. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of A Popular History of the Art of Music from the Earliest Times Until the Present, by W.S.B. Mathews. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Later composers and performers. Before summing up the remaining names of musical history, a brief retrospect over the present century may be in place. The first quarter of the 19th century was distinguished by two composers of the first order, Beethoven and Schubert, and by a large number of highly gifted lesser artists, some of whom, such as Spohr and Weber, bid fair to remain long enrolled in the list of immortals. The second quarter of the century was made memorable by the rise and blossoming into full glory of the Romantic school, all the works of this school, excepting a few of the earlier of Mendelssohn, having been produced during this period. Mendelssohn, Schumann, Chopin, and the young Wagner were the active spirits of this time, and their productions not only enriched the store of the world's tone poetry, but changed the general direction of musical ideals in many ways. The great feature of the third quarter of the century was the conception and execution of the Wagnerian music drama, with its wealth of sense incitation, and its somber appeal to accumulated experiences of the race. The Ring of the Nibelungen was completed during this period and received its first performance at Bayreuth in 1876. During the same period Franz Liszt had conceived a modification of the symphony form, bringing its four movements into a single one, or uniting the different movements, if such there were, by means of motives common to all or several of them. In this way a certain novelty was attainable in the most important province of instrumental music. And while the new compositions generally acknowledged their indebtedness to external incitation by titles, such as What One Sees from a Mountain, The Battle of the Huns, Romeo and Juliet, and the like, there was nothing to prevent them being in the fullest sense musical works, having a musical life, as such wholly independent of the suggestion given by the title. Berlioz had been the founder of program music, and his leading works had been produced during the second quarter of the century, but their full force was not recognized until later. It was a follower of Liszt, the brilliant Frenchman, Camille Saint-Saëns, who stated the central thesis of the whole Romantic school when he said that a composer had the same right to affix a title to his work in order to give it a pleasing standpoint for judging it as a painter had to name his picture. And in the case of music, he added, as in that of painting, the real question finally was not whether the suggestion of the title had been fully satisfied, but whether the picture were good painting and the composition good music. If it were good music, no flaw in the title and no disagreement between the title and the work could impair its value and lasting quality. When carefully scrutinized, the progress of music during the present century has been governed by certain leading principles which are not contradictory, although at first glance they might appear so. Since the time of the Netherlandish contrapuntists, the primary impulse in musical creation has been the musical ideal, the creation of tonal fancies, novel, inspiring, musical, satisfactory. Out of this desire has arisen the entire fabric of fugue, sonata, symphony, and the whole world of free music. And at every period there have been those also who sought to connect these tonal fancies with the inner life of the spirit, to awaken feeling, inspire imagination, deepen dramatic impression. In short, to give us in place of irresponsible tonal crystallizations a poetically conceived discourse, operative upon the feelings and stimulative to the entire mind. This was the ideal of the new movement in Italy at the beginning of the 17th century, and opera has steadily worked along this ideal. Sebastian Bach had moments when he himself attempted the program music, and Beethoven made many attempts of the same kind, some of which are significant and lasting. Hence, the romantic impulse was not something new in the history of music, but the blossoming of buds from seeds planted long before. The program music of Berlioz was simply larger and more flamboyant than the little exercises of Bach in the same direction. Wagner's idea of bringing together the entire resources of musical, dramatic, and scenic art into a single highly complex work was merely the idea of the unity of all the arts, upon which Aeschylus worked 2,000 years earlier, and upon which Jacopo Peri and Claudio Monteverdi worked at the beginning of the 17th century. In short, the art of music, while in this century being enriched by a multitude of new creations representing a variety of subordinate ideals, is nevertheless still a unity, constantly becoming more elaborate and masterly upon the tonal side, and continually more and more in touch with the deeper springs of duration in art, the intuitively realized correspondence between certain art forms and modes of expression and human feeling. The composers of the last quarter of the century are very numerous indeed, so numerous that a catalogue even of their names would occupy too much space. Moreover, their proximity to our own times brings them too near for successfully estimating their places in the pantheon of art, or even for the much simpler task of deciding upon certain names which undoubtedly should occupy places in the list. For present purposes, it will be more convenient to notice them by nationalities, since every racial stock has certain individualities and ideals which the national composers eventually bring into art, as we see brilliantly illustrated in the case of the Russians, both in music and in painting. There are, however, certain names which stand out above all others, and at the present writing appear destined for place among or very near the immortals of the first order. These great names are those of Johannes Brahms, Camille Saint-Saëns, Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, Antonin Dvorak, and Edvard Grieg. Part 1. Music in Germany. In Germany, very naturally, the activity in the higher departments of music remains more intense than in any other country, and the seat of musical empire may be said to still abide in southern Germany, where it was established by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. The most eminent living composer in the higher department of the art, Johannes Brahms, resides at Vienna since these many years. There also Max Bruch long resided, and there the greatest of the light opera composers, the Strauss family, and von Suppé, have lived and worked. It is in the provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, moreover, that the Bohemian composer Dvorak has his home. In Johannes Brahms, 1833, we have still living a musical master of the first order, whose quality as master is shown in his marvelous technique, in which respect no recent composer is to be mentioned as his superior, if any can be named since Bach his equal. This technique was at first personal at the pianoforte, upon which he was a virtuoso of phenomenal rank. But this renown, great as it is in well-informed circles, sinks into insignificance beside his marvelous ability at marshalling musical periods, elaborating together the most dissimilar and apparently incompatible subjects, and his powers of varying a given theme and of unfolding from it ever something new. These wonderful gifts, for such they were, rather than laboriously acquired attainments, Brahms showed at the first moment when the light of musical history shines upon him. It was in 1853, when the Hungarian violinist Eduard Remenyi found him at Hamburg and engaged him as accompanist, and having ascertained his astonishing talents, brought him, a young man of 20, to Liszt at Weimar, with his first trio and certain other compositions in manuscript. The new talent made a prodigious effect upon Liszt, who needed not that anyone should certify to him whether a composer had genius or merely talent. The Liszt circle took up the Brahms cult in earnest, played the trio at the chamber concerts, and the members, when they departed to their homes, generally carried with them their admiration of this new personality which had appeared in music. Johannes Brahms was born at Hamburg, May 7, 1833, the son of a fine musician who was player upon the double bass in the orchestra there. The boy was always intended for a musician, and his instruction was taken in hand with so much success that at the age of 14 he played in public pieces by Bach and Beethoven, and a set of original variations. At the age of 20 he was a master, and it was in this year that he accompanied Remenyi, made the acquaintance of Joachim and Liszt, and had a rarely appreciative notice from a master no less than Robert Schumann himself, who in his new Journal of Music said, "He has come a youth at whose cradle graces and heroes kept watch. Sitting at the piano, he began to unveil wonderful regions. We were drawn into more and more magical circles by his playing, full of genius, which made of the piano an orchestra of lamenting and jubilant voices. There were sonatas, or rather veiled symphonies, songs whose poetry might be understood without words, piano pieces both of a demoniac nature and of the most graceful form, sonatas for piano and violin, string quartets, each so different from every other that they seem to flow from many different springs. Whenever he bends his magic wand, there, when the powers of the orchestra and the chorus lend him their aid, further glimpses of the magical world will be revealed to us. May the highest genius strengthen him. Meanwhile, the spirit of modesty dwells within him. His comrades greet him at his first entrance into the world of art, where wounds may perhaps await him, but bay and laurel also. We welcome him as a valiant warrior." The next few years were spent by Brahms in directing orchestra and chorus at Detmold and elsewhere, and in Switzerland, which has always had great attraction for him. In 1859 he played in Leipzig his first great piano concerto. Most of the criticisms thereon were, however, such as now excite mirth. Lately he has played in Leipzig again, conducted several of his works, and was greeted with the reverence and enthusiasm due the greatest living representative of the art of music. In 1862 Brahms located in Vienna, where he has almost ever since resided. Mr. Louis Kestelborn, in Famous Composers and Their Works, says, "About 30 years ago the writer first saw Brahms in his Swiss home. At that time he was of a rather delicate, slim-looking figure, with a beardless face of ideal expression. Since then he has changed in appearance. Until now he looks the very image of health, being stout and muscular, the noble manly face surrounded by a full gray beard." The writer well remembers singing under his direction, watching him conduct orchestra rehearsals, hearing him play alone or with orchestra, listening to an after-dinner speech or private conversation, observing him while attentively listening to other works, and seeing the modest smile with which he accepted or rather declined expressions of admiration. The most important works of Brahms, aside from his German Requiem, are 4 symphonies for orchestra, 2 concertos for piano, a concerto for violin and cello with orchestra, a violin concerto, many songs, a variety of compositions for chamber, embracing a number for unusual combinations of instruments, such as clarinet and horn with piano, sonatas for piano solo, etc. In the songs he attains a simple and direct expression, not surpassed in musical quality since Schubert and Schumann. In the concertos he is more for music than for display, which is merely to say that in conceiving the display of his solo instrument he has sought rather to display it at its best in a musical sense than to exhibit its peculiar tricks of dexterity. As a symphonist, he follows classic form, and is more successful than any other writer in the slow movements, a department in which most of the later writers are distinctly weak, since in an idealized folk song, which is the essential ideal of the symphonic slow movement, poverty of imagination cannot be concealed by dexterity of thematic treatment and modulation. As a writer for the pianoforte, he has made important enlargements of the technique, not alone in his arrangement of easier compositions by earlier writers, but still more by original demands upon the fingers as illustrated in his great sets of variations. Distinguished among German composers is Max Bruch, 1838, who was born at Cologne and educated there and almost everywhere else in Germany. Bruch is best known by his works for chorus with orchestra, of which Frithjof, A Roman Song of Triumph, The Song of Three Kings, Odysseus, Arminius are best known. His concerto for violin is also played in all parts of the world, but his opera of Hermione made but a moderate success at Berlin in 1872. Riemann considers his greatest works for mixed chorus to be Odysseus and Arminius, The Song of the Bell, and for male chorus Frithjof, Salamis and the Normans. His style is closely wrought, musical, full of deep and natural musical expression, and well-colored instrumentation. Anton Bruckner, 1824, a highly gifted organist and composer, has written 7 symphonies in which the style is very modern and shows the influence of the theatrical style of Wagner. He is a composer of considerable vigor. Part 2. Music in Russia. The awakening of musical art has been remarkable in all parts of the civilized world, and in many countries not previously distinguished in music, composers have arisen who have embodied the rhythms and spirit of the national songs in their works, composed dramatic works upon national subjects, and so have created a national school of music. In some cases, the works of these men have proven of worldwide acceptance. In others, they have set in operation musical life in their own country, and have been followed quickly by younger composers working in a more cosmopolitan vein, who have created works which have been taken into the current of the world's music and bid fair to hold an honorable position in the pantheon. One of the most brilliant cases of this kind is Russia, that country so vast, so powerful, so mysterious. The first composer in Russia to distinguish himself and to create a national opera was Mikhail Ivanovich Glinka, 1803-1877. Reader's note. Another source shows the dates as 1804 to 1857. Born near Selna, his first schooling was at the Adels Institute in St. Petersburg, where he distinguished himself in languages. But presently, under the teaching of Böhme upon the violin and Karl Mayer in pianoforte and theory, he showed the musical stuff which was in him. Leaving Russia for his health, he resided 4 years in Italy, constantly studying and incessantly composing. On his way back to Russia, he placed himself for a time under the teaching of the distinguished S. Dehn in Berlin in theory. Dehn recognized his originality and encouraged him to write Russian music. His first opera, A Life for the Tsar, December 9, 1836, was a great triumph. The subject was national. The contrast between Polish and Russian subjects in the music was brilliant, and actual or simulated folk songs gave a local coloring highly grateful to the Russian audience. The work received innumerable repetitions and still remains one of the most popular operatic works upon the Russian stage. His next work, Ruslan and Ludmilla, was also successful, and Liszt, who happened to be in Russia at the moment of its production, accorded the young composer distinguished praise. Berlioz took up the pen in honor of Glinka and his new Russian school of music, and so the composer's powers were widely celebrated. During the remainder of his life, Glinka made long residences in the south, especially in Spain, and several orchestral works with Spanish coloring represent this portion of his creative career. His last years were spent in rural life near St. Petersburg, busy with new opera projects, and especially seeking some rational manner of harmonizing the Russian popular songs. Riemann calls Glinka the Berlioz of Russia, in the originality of his invention and his clever technique, and something more, namely, that he created a national school of music for his country. The list of his works is very long, embracing compositions in almost every province. There are 2 symphonies, both unfinished, several dances for orchestra, a number of chamber compositions of various combinations of instruments, a tarantella for orchestra, with song and dance, La Kamarinskaya, etc. His operas, however, are his lasting monument. Anton von Rubinstein. The next great name in the roll of Russian music is that of the pianist Anton von Rubinstein, 1830-1895, who was born at Vekvotinets in Bessarabia. His father presently removed to Moscow, where he carried on a manufactory of lead pencils. The boy, Anton, showed such talent for music under the skillful and affectionate teaching of his mother that at the age of 10 he was brought before various musical authorities in Paris for opinions concerning his talent. His concert life began almost immediately from this period. His mother went with him, and wherever there were pauses of a few days, the studies were resumed, exactly as had been the case with Mozart long before. In 1848 he found a friend and appreciative companion in the Princess Helene, and then he wrote several operas upon Russian subjects, of which 2 were published, Dmitri Donskoy and Tons der Narr. The success of these works was such that in 1854 the composer was given a subvention for further foreign study by the Princess Helene and Count Wielhorski, upon which followed 4 brilliant years of incessant activity as virtuoso pianist and composer, extending as far as London and Paris. Rubinstein had already lived some years in Berlin, where he was as well known as at home. Returning to Russia in 1859, he received important appointments as musical director, founded the St. Petersburg Musical Conservatory, of which he remained the director until 1867, when ensued a new series of concert journeys covering Europe, and in 1872-1873 extending to America, where he had a wonderful success, carrying back to Russia as proceeds of the American tour the at that time unprecedented sum of $54,000. As pianist, Rubinstein was distinguished for his grand style, broad and noble mastery of the instrument, and his consummate sympathy and innate musical quality. He was a player of moods, at times playing like a god. At other times his work disfigured by many errors, but always interesting, commanding, and noble. He played best the compositions of Beethoven and Schumann, their innate depth and intense musical expression appealing to his richly gifted musical nature irresistibly. His personality was commanding and attractive. Saint-Saëns relates how Rubinstein played in Paris the concertos of Beethoven and of Rubinstein, while Saint-Saëns conducted the orchestra. At the close of the concerts, Rubinstein desired to give yet another in which he himself would direct the orchestra, while Saint-Saëns should play. It was for this occasion that the Saint-Saëns second concerto was written. In his later life, Rubinstein lived like a prince in a beautiful estate near St. Petersburg. The list of his works is something enormous. Of operas and dramatic works there are 12, several of which, such as The Tower of Babel, Paradise Lost, and Moses, are biblical operas, a type of dramatico-mystical work created by Rubinstein. It contains the gravity and depth of oratorio, combined with the intense realism of the stage. There are 6 symphonies, of which the famous and several times enlarged Ocean Symphony is perhaps best known. A heroic fantasia for orchestra, 3 character pieces for orchestra, Faust, Don Quixote, and Ivan, 3 concerto overtures, a quantity of chamber music, compositions for piano, songs, and the like. In everything of Rubinstein, beautiful melodies are found. His weakness lies in the development, which occasionally is carried too far, and with insufficient vitality of thematic work. Even greater than Rubinstein as composer was the brilliant Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, 1840-1893. Tchaikovsky was intended for the profession of the law. in which he took his degree. But his love for music asserted itself, and after a short career as pupil in the St. Petersburg Conservatory, he was appointed teacher of harmony in that institution, and entered upon his career as composer. Here he remained but a short time, resigning in 1877, after which he lived by turns at St. Petersburg, in Italy, and in Switzerland. Tchaikovsky was of a lyric musical nature, and in his early life his taste was entirely for Italian music. This shows to a remarkable degree in all his earlier productions, even if he had not himself published the fact so often and unmistakably. In 1869 he produced his first Russian opera, Der Voivoda, which was followed by 8 others, of which the best known are Eugene Onegin and Makula the Smith. Several of these are now played throughout Europe. It was in his orchestral compositions, however, that Tchaikovsky most illustrated his unexampled powers. Besides a number of brilliant and highly sensational overtures, he composed 6 symphonies of unexampled sonority, rich coloring, and strange musical expression. The 5th Symphony of Tchaikovsky met with almost universal recognition at the hands of the leading orchestral conductors of the world, and the last, the so-called tragic, only deepened the impression of the composer's powers. Several points are unusual. The themes themselves are original, forceful, and lend themselves easily to elaboration. The harmonic treatment is highly original, as if the author had found, as BERLIOZ said, new harmonic paths. The instrumentation is richly colored, and the climaxes are of vast power and effect. The whole is a grandly composed tone poem, which, even if regarded as surpassing the proper reserve of symphonic form, must nevertheless be counted as one of the most valuable enrichments of the world's orchestral repertory. In several places in his works, Tchaikovsky introduces peculiarities of Russian folk music, as, for example, in the movement in 5/4 measure in the 5th Major Symphony. Nevertheless, the works belong to the world's music, being in no sense provincial, narrow, or limited. Aesthetically considered, they illustrate the quick technique and overmastering energy of the race to which the composer belonged. Part 3. Music in Bohemia. Another country in which a notable musical revival has taken place during the latter part of the present century is Bohemia, where 2 names are to be mentioned. Bedřich Smetana, 1824-1884, is to be remembered as the creator, or at least the awakener, of Bohemian music. After short education at the Prague University, Smetana entered diligently upon the study of music, becoming a brilliant pianist, and as such forming one of the circle of enthusiastic and advancing souls surrounding Liszt at Weimar between 1850 and 1860. His first position as musical director was at Gothenburg, 1856. Here he lost his wife, the brilliant pianist Katarina Kolar. In 1861 he made a long concert tour to Sweden. In 1866 he was appointed director of the music at the National Theatre in Prague, a position which he held until obliged to give it up on account of loss of hearing in 1874. Smetana wrote 8 operas upon Bohemian subjects, with music in the Bohemian spirit. One best known is The Bartered Bride, which was the last composed. He also wrote about 10 symphonies, or symphonic poems, and a great variety of chamber music. Of his symphonic poems, those most often played are in Wallenstein's Camp, Moldau, Zarka, and Visegrad. In all these the titles are mainly suggestive, although in Zarka a program is quite closely followed. Smetana was a brilliant composer, but his value lies in his awakening of the Bohemians to musical creation. Anton Dvorak, the most brilliant name in Bohemian music, and the one most valued by the world in general, is that of Anton Dvorak, 1841, who was the son of a butcher at Mulhausen. The boy early applied himself to the violin, and after some years playing in small orchestras, found a place as violinist in the orchestra of the National Theatre at Prague. This was at the age of 19. About 10 years later, he first attracted attention as composer by means of a hymn for mixed chorus and orchestra. The attention of his countrymen thus gained, Dvorak fastened still more by a succession of compositions of varied scope, ranging from the Slavic dances and Slavic rhapsodies to symphonies, chamber music, and choral works of great brilliancy. In 1892, Dr. Dvorak was called to New York as director of the so-called National Conservatory of Music. In 1895, he returned to Bohemia. The choral works of Dvorak were generally first written for English musical festivals: The Spectre's Bride, Stabat Mater, Saint Ludmilla. The list of his works includes 5 symphonies for full orchestra, several concert overtures, a very beautiful air, and variations for orchestra, and 7 operas upon Bohemian subjects. Dvorak is one of the most gifted composers of the present time, especially in the matter of technique. His thematic treatment is always clever, his orchestral coloring rich and varied, and his style elegant. If deficiency is to be recorded concerning him, it is in invention or innate weight of ideas. During his residence in America, he promulgated the idea that an American school of music was to be created by developing the themes and rhythms of the Negro melodies, and he wrote a symphony, From the New World, in order to illustrate his meaning. The second or slow movement of this work attained a distinguished success almost everywhere, but the themes of the first and last movement are not sufficient for the treatment they receive. This work has been more successful in Europe than in this country. Perhaps the most notable quality of Dr. Dvorak's personality is his naivete, which shows well in his music. He is quite like a modern Haydn, who has learned and remembered everything of musical coloration which has been discovered, but who applies his knowledge in a simple and direct manner, without straining after effect. Part 4. Music in Scandinavia. Foremost of Scandinavian composers is Edvard Hagerup Grieg, 1843, who was born at Bergen, Norway. He received his early musical education from his mother, who was an excellent pianist and very musical. By the advice of the celebrated violinist Ole Bull, Grieg was sent in 1858 to Leipzig for further instruction, where he became a pupil of Moscheles, Hauptmann, Reinecke, Richter, and Wenzel. In 1863 he pursued further studies under Gade at Copenhagen. In companionship with a talented young composer, Richard Nordrak, Grieg set himself, as he says, against the faded Scandinavianism of Gade and Mendelssohn, intermingled and undertook to put into tones the real beauty, strength, and inner spirit of the northern folk's life. He composed in many varieties of work, and in 1879 attained German recognition by playing his own piano concerto at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig. Grieg's works are full of poetry, easy and natural expression, and are pervaded by northern coloring so decided as in some cases to approach what in speech is called dialect. Nevertheless, it is indubitable that his music has distinctly enriched the world's stream of tone poetry, and introduced a new accent and voice. He has distinguished himself in almost every department, in songs, choral work, chamber music, symphonies, sonatas for piano and and violin, and orchestral suites, of which perhaps his 2 Peer Gynt are the most celebrated. In person, Grieg is slight, fair-haired, with lovely deep blue eyes, and a charming manner. He is subject to pulmonary weakness, and is compelled to reside much of his time in warmer climates than those of his native land. An older composer than Grieg is Niels Wilhelm Gade, 1817-1890, of Copenhagen, who, after a thorough musical education received in his native city, attracted wider attention in 1841 by taking the prize for his concert overture Night Sounds from Ossian, the judges being Fr. Schneider and Spohr, the violinist. This gave Gade a royal stipendium, with which he immediately betook himself to study at Leipzig, where he came under the personal influence of Mendelssohn, an influence which he never outgrew. At the death of Mendelssohn he was appointed director of the Gewandhaus, but not proving in all respects satisfactory, he held the position only a part of one season. After the death of Gläser in 1861, Gade was made royal music director at Copenhagen, a position which he filled many years. He was active as composer in every direction, his published works embracing 8 symphonies, 5 overtures, 2 concertos for violin and orchestra, 3 violin sonatas, several cantatas for mixed voices, soli and orchestra, and many other works. The ultimate judgment of Gade as a tone poet is likely to be that, while distinctly talented, he never attained imagination of the first order. Among the younger composers, Christian Zindig, 1856, is to be mentioned. Besides many works for chamber, he has written 1 symphony which, while not very original, gives promise of better productions later. Part 5. Music in England. The relation of England to the higher art of music has been peculiar. In the 16th century and earlier, it was one of the most musical countries in Europe. But from the appearance of Handel about 1720, German music and German composers absorbed public attention to the exclusion of the natives, no one of whom, it may be added, evinced creative powers of any high order. England was a liberal patron of all the leading German masters, from Haydn, who wrote 12 symphonies for the London Philharmonic, to Beethoven, whose 9th symphony was written for the same society, Mendelssohn, whose Elijah was written for the Birmingham Festival, and Wagner, who received handsome compensation for conducting a series of concerts in London. A little past the middle of the present century, however, more creative activity began to show itself among English composers, until at the present time there are excellent English composers in all the leading departments of musical production. The more celebrated names follow. One of the most graceful and talented of English composers was Sir William Sterndale Bennett, 1816-1875, who came of a musical stock and was duly trained as a choir boy in King's Chapel and at the Royal Academy of Music. In 1836 he went to Leipzig in order to profit by the Gewandhaus concerts there and the friendship of Mendelssohn. Here he produced a number of orchestral compositions which were so highly esteemed that in 1853 the directorship of the Gewandhaus concerts were offered him. After a short sojourn at Leipzig, he returned to London, where he ever after lived, highly honored as composer, pianist, teacher, and man. In 1856 he became the conductor of the London Philharmonic concerts, and in 1866 principal of the Royal Academy of Music. He was knighted in 1871, having previously been honored by degrees from Cambridge and Oxford. He was professor of music in Cambridge University from 1856 until his death. As a composer, Bennett was influenced by Mendelssohn, but he had much delicacy of fancy and a certain originality of his own. His compositions embrace 4 concertos for piano and orchestra, several concert overtures for orchestra, 1 symphony, much chamber music, a cantata, The May Queen, 1858, The Woman of Samaria, 1867, and a number of occasional odes, anthems, and part songs. The successor of Sterndale Bennett as principal of the Royal Academy of Music was Sir George A. Macfarren, 1813-1887, who, although totally blind for many years before his death, produced a greater number of important compositions than any other English composer of the century. He was educated in London, and in 1834 became one of the professors in the Royal Academy of Music. His first opera was produced in 1838, Devil's Opera. Don Quixote, 1836, Jessie Lee, 1863, and Helvellyn, 1864. He wrote a number of cantatas for chorus and orchestra, oratorios, St. John the Baptist, 1873, The Resurrection, 1876, Joseph, 1877, and other works of less importance. There are also many anthems, several overtures, and other pieces for chamber. Personally, he was kind-hearted, intelligent, helpful, and public-spirited. The amount of work that he accomplished under the greatest of disadvantages is wonderful, as well as its generally superior quality. As a lecturer and teacher, he was the foremost musical Englishman of his time. His compositions are strong and respectable, but not especially inspired. The successor of Sir George Macfarren in the principalship of the Royal Academy of Music was Alexander Campbell Mackenzie, 1847, the youngest eminent English composer, but also the most successful and promising. He was educated as a violinist and resided at Edinburgh as a teacher of the pianoforte and violin until his compositions attracted the attention of his countrymen and induced his being called to London. The most important compositions of Dr. Mackenzie up to the present time are the operas Colomba, 1883, The Troubadour, 1886, and the oratorio, The Rose of Sharon, 1884. There are several cantatas, Jason, The Bride, The Story of Said, 1886, and a considerable number of orchestral pieces, of which 2 Scotch rhapsodies and the overture to Twelfth Night are the best known. He has also produced a violin concerto played by Mr. Sarasate, and much chamber music and songs. On the whole, Dr. Mackenzie seems the most gifted English composer who has yet appeared. End of chapter 39. End of A Popular History of the Art of Music from the Earliest Times Until the Present. Reading by Tony Oliva, Albuquerque, New Mexico, May 2013.